Welcome everyone to tonight's meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee. Before we commence the meeting, I request that all mobile telephones be turned off or switched to silent. Thank you. This meeting is being live streamed on the Council website, so you will be able to view the proceedings of the meeting, councillor deliberations and voting. The meeting is also being recorded and will be made available on the Council website as soon as practicable after the meeting. Should technical problems be encountered during the meeting will be adjourned until the problem is rectified, or if needed, the meeting will be postponed. My name is Councillor Jim Park and I chair the committee. I'll start by introducing my fellow councillors and officers. Seated to my left at the horseshoe table, the Mayor, Councillor Gary Thompson, Councillor Susan Bigger, Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Nick Stavrou, Councillor Felicity Sinfield, Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, Councillor Wes Galt, Councillor Di Gillies, Councillor Jane Addis and Councillor Victor Franco. Officers in attendance tonight, seated behind Councillor Watson is Philip Storer, the Chief Executive Officer. Seated to my immediate right is Sharan Wickramasinghe, the Director of Urban Living. To his right, Simon Mitchell, the Manager of Strategic and Statutory Planning. Seated to my immediate left, David Thompson, the Manager of Governance and Legal. And to his left, Helen Pavlidis, the Senior Governance Officer. There are also a number of other officers in attendance this evening and they'll be introduced as they present reports. Essentially, the purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. This committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. Councillors are familiar with the reports, which include a summary of the objections received. For those in the gallery presenting this evening, when we come to the agenda item, it will be introduced by an officer. I will then call you one by one to come forward and address the committee. If you are making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the planning application. Please don't repeat what earlier speakers have said and keep your submission focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you are opposed to the planning application, please inform the committee why you are opposed and suggest an alternative approach which would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or detail in the officer's report. Note that there is a strict time limit of 3 minutes for each speaker, including councillors, and whilst as chairperson I reserve the right to vary that time, I seldom do. I'll ask speakers to stand at the lectern and invite those speaking against first, followed by those in favour. At the 2.5 minute mark, I'll make the sound indicating that you have 30 seconds remaining to conclude your presentation. Turning now to the agenda, apologies. Mr Thompson, have we received any apologies for the meeting?
Through you, Mr Chair, there are no apologies for this evening. Thank
you. Item 1, adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the meeting held on 3 May 2021. In search of a motion. Councillor Thompson.
Happy to move the minutes as printed.
And that's seconded by Councillor Hollingsworth. Is there any discussion? I'll put that motion. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Item 2, declaration of conflict of interest of any councillor or council officer. Are there any such declarations? No. Item 3, presentation of officer reports. 3.1, Kew Hebrew Synagogue Heritage Post-Exhibition Summary. That report will be presented by Mr Nick Brennan, Senior Strategic Planner.
Thank you, and through you, Mr Chair. 53 Walpole Street, which is also known as 11 Malmesbury Street in Kew, is currently occupied by the Kew Jewish Centre and the Giant Steps School. Heritage Overlay HO 559 applies to the Bet Bachman Synagogue building. On the 24th of May 2020, Council received a request from a community member to investigate the heritage significance of the buildings at the site not protected by the Heritage Overlay. This request was made in response to a planning permit application to expand facilities for the school, which proposed demolition of many of these buildings. Council officers engaged heritage consultants Context to undertake the heritage assessment. Context concluded that the heritage overlay should be extended to cover the entire site, as the buildings on the site that were not currently covered by the heritage overlay are of local historical, architectural, rarity, social and associative heritage significance. On the 7th of September 2020, the UPDC resolved to adopt a heritage citation for the site and to write to the Minister for Planning seeking authorisation to prepare and exhibit a planning scheme amendment to extend the heritage overlay across the entire site. Authorisation for Amendment C342 was granted on the 13th of November 2020. Exhibition was carried out between the 18th of February and the 19th of March 2021. At the conclusion of the exhibition period, a total of 5 submissions were received. Of these, 3 were in support of the proposed heritage overlay and 2 were opposed. Following the conclusion of the exhibition period, the Board of the Congregation wrote to Council to withdraw the submission that had previously been submitted on their behalf in support of the amendment. This was submission 2, which is now shown as withdrawn. An additional late supporting submission from the Kew Historical Society was received after the conclusion of the exhibition period. Following the drafting of this report, 4 further late submissions have been received, 3 are in support of the amendment and 1 is opposed. The late submissions have not raised any new issues or concerns beyond those already discussed within the report. The key issues raised within the submissions were concerns that the heritage overlay would have a negative impact on future development of the site and requesting changes to the heritage citation. Officers have reviewed all submissions and are not recommending any changes to the amendment or to the heritage citation in response. As advised at the previous UPDC meeting on the 3rd of April, a planning permit application for development of the site has been referred to a standing advisory committee for consideration by the Minister for Planning. That hearing has now been deferred to mid-June. Strategic planning officers have spoken to officers at DELP. They have advised that it would be reasonable for Council to continue progressing this amendment, as it is currently unclear how the standing advisory committee process will impact on the introduction of the heritage overlay. In light of the late submissions received, officers are proposing an alternative recommendation to that published in the report. The alternative recommendation recommends that the UPDC resolve to receive and refer all submissions received, including all late submissions, to an independent planning panel for consideration. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. We have 2 speakers tonight, the first of whom is Mr Nick Sissons. If you could come forward, please. And if I could just ask you to commence your presentation with your name and address, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor and Councillors. My name's Nick Sissons. I'm from HWL Ebsworth Lawyers, here representing both the Kew Hebrew Congregation Incorporated and the trustees of the Norman Smorgon House Trust. For the purpose of the record, the address would be the business address, which is level 8447 Collins Street in Melbourne. My clients strongly oppose the implementation of Amendment C342, being the expansion of the heritage overlay. The key change in position for the Kew Hebrew Congregation is a direct result of the recent board elections and the overwhelming support of the majority of members that saw a new board coming in with a new position to oppose this. As was addressed to the councillors before, about the planning permit for the modification of the school buildings, this proposal is by the Giant Steps Melbourne Group. It's a group that provides community education for children with autism. This receives the blessing of the trustees and the majority of the congregation, and Giant Steps Melbourne has recently received a significant Commonwealth funding to help facilitate this program. My clients are concerned that the council is placing stronger preference on the retention of a collection of older buildings that have little or no built heritage value and only offer a very limited social or cultural value. Whilst the City of Boroondara might consider the collection of buildings significant on the site, the congregation and the trustees do not place any significant weight on the majority of the buildings. The trustees and congregation are mindful of their roles as guardians and protectors of the ideas, values and intentions of the late Norman Smorgon and those who worked with him to create the facility for the benefit of the Jewish community in Melbourne. From a social cultural heritage perspective, the Jewish traditions and teachings place very little value on buildings, decorations and physical assets. The traditions and teachings are about good deeds, acts of loving kindness and repair of the world. It is about a spiritual and emotional well-being being at the heart of the priorities of their religion, their values and culture. The opportunity for expansion of the Norman Smorgon House and the creation of spaces in the kindergarten and the junior school for the Jewish children in the early days was about creating a need because of the lack of ability for teaching of the Jewish faith and traditions. Memories do not live in buildings, they live in people and stories that are shared. The story and evolution of the Kew Hebrew congregation is ever evolving and dynamic. There's no material significance in the buildings for the congregation. If this amendment proceeds, there will be some detriment to both giant steps because the introduction of a heritage overlay will actually, if it comes through after a minister grants the permit, will stop the project dead in its tracks, requiring the giant steps to come back to council for further planning permission. We'd implore council to abandon the amendment at this point in time, and in the alternate, we're encouraged to give serious consideration to a significant modification and hold off until the minister's made its decision on the planning application. Thank you, Mayor and councillors.
Thank you. I'll just ask you to wait there for a moment to see if there's any questions. There doesn't appear to be, so thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Claire O'Callaghan. And again, if you could commence your presentation with your name and address, please.
Thank you. I'm Claire O'Callaghan. I live at 52 Walpole Street in Kew, and I support the entire Hebrew Sites Heritage Overlay. Birrendara's Community Plan Strategic Priority 4 aims to protect the city's cultural heritage. The profound contribution of Jewish people to Birrendara is exemplified in the congregation site, including the current inspiring Small Steps teachers and students with autism who regularly walk in local streets. Birrendara's Priority 4 also aims to balance development with character, heritage and amenity. Non-heritage overlay of the Hebrew site paves the way for high-density development. In recent decades, Walpole Street has endured destruction of many old buildings, replaced with high-density sites, substantially reducing the district's heritage, character and livability. Human density and traffic congestion in this residential area is beyond capacity, reducing safety of local school children and frail-aged citizens from nearby care homes. There are about 20 heritage buildings and precincts within 800 metres of the congregation. To actualise Priority 4, the council should declare more buildings and precincts surrounding the Hebrew congregation as heritage. Further, Birrendara Council values treating heritage with respect and integrity, but the city treats its custodians of heritage buildings poorly. Custodians are encumbered by building restrictions and permits that others are not subjected to. When heritage buildings are not in heritage precincts, property valuations reduce. Many bought these buildings before overlays were imposed. Heritage building owners are therefore financially burdened in order to maintain community amenity. This is disrespectful, especially when many councils, including Melbourne, Ballarat and in Europe, give grants to owners to maintain heritage buildings for their communities. In sum, the Hebrew congregation should have heritage overlay because of its historical significance. I also make 3 requests. First, the site becomes part of an historical precinct, ensuring the area's heritage. Second, Burundara financially supports the Jewish community and other heritage building custodians for unfair burdens imposed. And third, if heritage overlay is not granted and more high density development allowed, all heritage overlays in Walpole Street should be removed because a maintenance of heritage threshold will have been breached. Thank you.
Thank you. There don't appear to be any questions. No, you're okay. There's none. So, councillors, any? Oh, we've got a late question, have we?
No, I don't. It's
No?
a foreshadowing, Mr. Chair.
Okay, that's fine. Mr. Brennan.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, just to address some of the points raised there. The significance of the site and the buildings on the site has been identified by context as having historical, architectural, rarity, social and associative heritage significance. It's not merely the fact that the site has historically been used as a Jewish congregation site. There are other elements within the site that have been identified as having heritage significance. The heritage overlay doesn't, in terms of the development or use of the site, the heritage overlay doesn't prohibit development or use. It merely seeks that any development has regard to the identified heritage significance of that site and doesn't have an unreasonable detrimental impact on that. There's no specific reason that an increased number of students or staff on that site could not be accommodated, making use of the existing buildings. The heritage overlay doesn't say that development cannot take place. With regards to the suggestion that the amendment be put on hold, the advice from the Minister's Department is not to do that, and given even taking into account the referral of the planning permit to the advisory committee, their advice to council staff is that we continue to progress the amendment. At the moment, there is no reason to put it on hold or to abandon it just because of the permit consideration at the advisory committee. And beyond that, the final approval of the heritage overlay sits with the Minister for Planning. Council can adopt the amendment, but we then submit it to the Minister for his approval. If he seeks fit to grant the development application, then he will have that in his mind when he gets the amendment before him to make a decision on that. It is within his power to take that into consideration. Finally, the heritage overlay doesn't make any requests or requirements for any specific maintenance or upkeep of properties. That rests with property owners, as it does with properties that are not in the heritage overlay. The overlay doesn't require any specific, any more or above and beyond maintenance other than of properties not in the heritage overlay. It is a matter of the property owner to maintain their property in a manner that they see fit. I believe that is all. Thank you.
Thank you. And just before I invite questions, can you confirm that the substantive difference between the recommendation in the report and the alternative is simply the reception and noting of the late submissions?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. We've added point 2, which specifically notes receipt of the late submissions, and a change to point 5, which specifies that late submissions will also be referred to the planning panel.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to move the motion to accept or adopt the officer's recommendation.
Yep, we'll come to that. Just questions at the moment. So do you have any questions at all?
Not as such at the moment.
Thank you. Can we just enlighten the public gallery on the left that's been plunged into darkness? And Councillor Thompson, you have a question.
I do. Thanks, through you, Chair. Recognising that the original Smorgon building dates back over 100 years, and there's been multiple extensions to this building over that period of time, do we know how intact the original facade is of that existing building?
Through you, Mr. Chair. I don't know specifically how intact that building is, but there certainly is from... it is difficult to see the facade of the building, that is to be acknowledged. It has been extended or built around on all sides. the intactness of that original building is not a strong element of the significance of the site.
So if I can have a follow-up through you, Chair. So if that's being the case, is it the collection of all the extensions that give heritage value to this site?
It is the development and use of the site over time that contributes to the significance of the various buildings. So there is the original house by itself would not likely be considered to have heritage significance. But given its use over time and the growth and development of the site, culminating in the construction of the synagogue and the school buildings around it as associated buildings, as a collection of buildings on the site, they all have heritage significance together.
Thanks, Chair.
Are there any further questions? No, then Councillor Stavrou is moving the alternate officer recommendation. Yes?
Yes, I am.
And is there a seconder for that? Councillor Bigger.
Yep, I'm happy to second that.
Just to assist Councillor Stavrou, is there any opposition at this juncture? Potentially. I'll ask you to speak to your motion, Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanking the officers for their excellent work, and appreciate the public making their representations as well. Look, as I see it, and I read the officer's recommendation very attentively, and their recommendation is supported very well by the report in the way that they made a nexus between the building's evolution and the history associated with the Jewish community, in particular the Jewish community in Boroondara. But that's the sort of expert approach, and we must appreciate that. But also, heritage is really, common sense would tell us that it's a common English word, and we all know what it means. We all rightly get upset when Indigenous site is damaged or worse, destroyed, as we are when significant historical sites internationally are damaged or destroyed and not there any longer. Heritage in this sense can be recognised, obviously, under many guises. It could be Indigenous, religious, political, historical, cultural, and multicultural contributions, just to name a few. As a ward councillor, and in this sense, most important issue one of the most important issues that my community have raised with me is that of heritage. So I'm keenly aware of that. Our council regularly conducts community feedback, and this feedback shows that the issue of heritage is right up there for the people of Boroondara. As a council, we honour that, and we have a strategy which is in the report and quoted in there, strategy 4.3, but it's well worth quoting it, and it is to preserve the city's history and protect heritage properties and precincts by undertaking a municipal-wide heritage review and introduce heritage overlays in the Boroondara planning scheme, and certainly the officer's recommendation will assist in that. I think, and I do appreciate the particular connection, obviously, that the community representatives have of the Hebrew side, but I would say sometimes that these buildings, these heritage buildings, tend to be three-dimensional monuments in the community to actually read that history for people that are going to come way after us. I certainly have benefited from many of these buildings to have learned part of the history of Boroondara, and I think that that's one of the major reasons to preserve certain buildings if they have that merit. So on the basis of that, I really urge my fellow councillors to support the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers? Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I'm happy to support the ward councillor in moving this so it goes off to the planning panel. I'll be really interested to see what the planning panel seeks from this and how they view all of the submissions, both for and against. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Chair.
Any other speakers? Councillor Stavrou, do you wish to exercise your right of reply?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll put that motion. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. That takes us then to item 3.2, 18 Webb Street, Glen Iris. That will be presented by Ms Kelly Caparosa, Senior Statutory Planner.
Through you, Mr Chair, I present UPDC item 3.2, planning permit application PP20/0342 for the land at 18 Webb Street in Glen Iris. The proposal seeks to construct two-storey dwellings. The proposal was originally for 3 dwellings and 1 dwelling has been removed to address concerns raised by officers and objectors. Plans have been further amended to reduce the finished floor level of dwelling 2 to be consistent with natural ground level and increase setbacks of dwelling 2 along the western and southern boundaries. Each dwelling is provided with 2 car parking spaces in accordance with the required car parking rate. The dwellings are arranged one behind the other and contain pitched tiled roofs in accordance with Council's neighbourhood character policy. Subject to recommended conditions, the proposed development achieves full Res Code compliance. It exceeds Res Code requirements in relation to side and rear setbacks, daylight to existing windows, north-facing windows, site coverage, and overshadowing of open space. A condition will ensure full compliance with the overlooking standard. Objectors have raised concerns regarding the impact of the upper level to the rear dwelling, and it's noted that the rear dwelling has been amended to increase boundary setbacks and lower the building height. The rear dwelling complies with the building height standard, setback requirements, overshadowing and overlooking standards. The proposal has appropriately responded to the area's existing backyard character. At the ground floor, dwelling 2 has been set back 4 to 5.5 metres from the rear boundary, which provides for an area of backyard capable of accommodating a large canopy tree. The areas of open space for both dwellings exceed the Res Code requirements. The application is supported by Council's arborist. It retains the existing large olive tree within the front setback. It's recommended that a landscape plan be included as a permit condition, which requires 3 new canopy trees to be planted. The proposal will not unreasonably impact on neighbouring trees, and a tree management plan has been included as a suggested permit condition. It is recommended that Council issue a notice of decision to grant a planning permit, subject to the conditions detailed in the officer's recommendation. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you. I have submission forms from 4 people, 2 opposed and 2 in favour, but I note that the 2 persons who are in favour don't wish to speak, so we will only have 2 speakers, the first of whom is Mr Greg Price. Mr Price, if you can commence your presentation with your name and address, please.
Thanks, councillors. My name is Greg Price, 2A Barina Road in Glen Iris. I wish to speak in opposition to this permit. Essentially, there have been, from my reading, 15 objections to the planning application. My issue is there's been a permit trigger given that there's an application for multiple dwellings on a site, which is out of character for for that street. And typically the objections have come from the local people. The nature of the development, I think, is it's overdeveloping the site, given that the neighbourhood character statement talks about retaining the front and backyards, but this doesn't happen. It's like the new dwellings are substantially close to the rear fence, and given modern building standards, I'm not sure how you would get a large canopy tree in the backyard, given that you need at least a 1 metre boundary around foundations and things like that. So you're down to a couple of metres into the backyard. Part of the other issue is that there in the officer's report, there was talk about loss of leafy views is not controlled by the planning scheme. But the thing is, there has been a permit trigger here. So it's essentially, it's up to you councillors to decide is this the way we want to go and develop Boroondara? My issue is that we're seeing the erosion of our, leafy streetscapes. This is unfortunately, this is where the rubber meets the road. It's these kinds of applications. I grew up in Blackburn and I saw my parents' street become overwhelmed with these sorts of multi-dwelling units. And I noticed that there's another one further up the street. So there comes a point where we have to say, either we're going to allow this wholesale or that we stop it. As far as a visual bulk perspective, although it complies with res code and things like that, which most places in Melbourne do, the issue is that there's a driveway down the side, which means that the building form is actually 2 stories and rather narrow, whereas other modern dwellings that are 2 stories, they encompass the larger front of the property sort of thing. So you end up, the visual bulk is out of perspective with other modern buildings. And you do notice that it is a multi-dwelling unit, because although they're set one behind the other, that's only visible when you're directly opposite on the other side of the street. When you're walking up and down the footpaths on both sides, you'll see that it's a multi-dwelling unit. There's just no way of hiding that fact. Plus also the neighbours are impacted, because although they may not be overshadowed from sunlight, the neighbours in one backyard, it's like they have a pool there. They're going to see this big building. They obviously bought into the area wanting the large backyards. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just see if there's any questions. It doesn't appear to be, so thank you for your presentation.
Thanks very much.
Our next speaker is Mr. Nigel Cann. If you could come forward, please. And again, Mr. Cann, if you could commence your presentation with your name and address, please.
Nigel Cann, 9 Atkins Avenue, Glen Iris. My wife Jenny and I own the properties at 7 and 9 Atkins Avenue, which actually back onto the rear of the property in question. I'm also representing our other 3 neighbours who also share boundaries with this particular property. Ange in 11 Atkins Avenue, Jenny who's in 16 Webb Street, and Suma and Ash that are in 20 Webb Street. Next slide, please. We would like to recommend to the council that you reject this development plan. As the previous speaker, we think it overdevelops. It doesn't meet the neighbourhood residential zone, schedule zone in our opinion. It doesn't meet the objectives and guidelines in the precinct statement 63 for this area. It changes the amenity of how we use our properties in our backyards. It creates a very poor visual outcome, and it damages our well-being because we can't enjoy our properties the way that we intended when we purchased. Next slide, please. If you look at Jenny's backyard and the way that she uses as an entertainment space, next slide, please. It's now going to have a building overlooking the whole of that back area. Next slide, please. If you look at how Suma and Ash's children play in the backyard, soon that's going to look like this. Next slide, please. And you consider our position from our swimming pool. It's now going to look like this as we take our rest after doing our daily exercise. This is going to impact directly on everybody's well-being. Just consider this as your backyards, please, councillors, when you make the decision. Next slide, please. We have concerns about the colour scheme, particularly on the 2nd storey, which is going to be a charcoal colour sitting up above, which is going to contrast really badly with the sky that's going to be sitting in behind it from each of our 5 separate views. Next slide, please. We've already talked about the fact that the change in the garden settings, so we'll move on. Next slide, please. The precinct plan has a whole series of things that give guidelines about keeping the open space in this area, having large rear gardens to accommodate large trees. The proposal does not have a large garden. It's squeezing one tiny canopy tree in, which will do very little because it doesn't shade any, it doesn't prevent oversight from any of the properties that are actually there at the moment. Next slide, please. With regard to the planner's report, we think there's an oversight in the way that description's been given for the developments that already exist on the rear sections. All of the 3 that are highlighted are all single storied in the 2nd section, so they don't impact on the neighbours to the degree that this development is proposing for us as the direct boundary neighbours. Next slide, please. With regards to our swimming pools and the shadow plan that's been offered, the statutory requirement for a shadow plan in September does very little for how we actually use the area. Swimming pools are used in the summer. They're not used Well, they only just start being used in September. The shadow plan here does not take into account the effect of daylight saving, the effect of the sun moving further southeast. The shade will be further on our pools for longer. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we put forward that we would ask you to reject this proposal. I won't go through reasons, I've already been through that. If you do decide to approve the planning permit, we ask for a number of conditions. We would like the building colours changed. We think it needs to be in more natural earthy tones, which is keeping in character, again, with the 5 neighbours, or 4 of the 5 neighbours that are around that have new houses. We would like some increased vegetation in the plan as it exists at the moment. In particular, my wife and I would like another canopy tree that sits sort of in that southwest area overlooking our pool so that we've got something that helps prevent it. We've talked with a trellis when we've talked with Victor, but we don't think a trellis really is sufficient. We would really prefer a canopy tree. And the last little bit is, I mean, I know from when our house was developed, earthwork levels are not always done as they were supposed to be to the plan. So we'd just like to make sure that that gets verified before we can, before they actually start the building, that they actually get down to the levels that they say they're going to get down to. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just see if there's any questions. There's a question from Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Camp. Just wanted to ask, with the canopy tree, or ideally canopy trees, do you have a preference to an evergreen as opposed to deciduous?
In that spot, probably evergreen. Yeah, evergreen.
Thank you for that. I'll just have a follow-up question with officers later. Thank you.
And Councillor Franco.
Just a couple of questions about. Could we have the last slide back, because it'll assist with my asking of questions. In relation to the tree, the additional canopy tree that you've proposed, could you expand on exactly where you'd want that canopy tree? And
well, probably if you go back to that slide there that sort of showed the swimming pool, probably the best way to answer it. Essentially, it should be in the southern western side of front of the house, sort of in line with the centre of our pool would be the ideal position for it. So it's sort of the southwestern, the middle of the southwestern quadrant, I guess, of the planned open space. Does that sort of make sense? It's very difficult to describe.
Makes sense to me, but I don't know if it makes sense to my colleagues.
That's all clear. What is describing? Okay.
So it'd sort of, it would be something of the order of 3 metres in from their southern boundary. Where we'd expect the centre of that tree to be. Have I got that right?
Yep. All right. We'll keep going with your questions. Yep.
In relation to the trellis, which you've previously recommended, which you've suggested might not have an impact, could you explain why you don't think it'd have an impact? And if it were to have an impact, what height you think the trellis would need, or whether you're walking away from that?
The trellis came up in the discussions that we had on Friday. I don't think we specifically mentioned it. It was discussed by others. The issue that we have with the trellis is the fact that it would probably have to be something like 5 metres high to really achieve the sort of obscuring that we'd want, and that's not really achieved. That's better achieved by actually having a tree that performs that function.
And in relation to the colour changes that you've suggested, are you fixed in those colour changes, or how flexible?
Well, I thought we've left it pretty wide open to be earthy green sort of tones.
Okay.
I mean, that is keeping with the, you know, the 4 houses that have been developed. That's pretty much keeping in with what they are. And it is also something that would better blend in and with the trees that are around, and then also not be quite a contrast with the blue sky that's going to be sitting in behind it.
Okay, thank you.
And that concludes your questions, Councillor
That
Franklin?
concludes my questions.
Yep. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question with regard to the trellis. Obviously, if say a canopy tree was to be planted, it'd take a number of years to establish. Do you think a trellis in the short term would give you some benefit? Obviously not in the long term with a tree canopy, but obviously in the short term.
I guess yes is the obvious answer to that question. Yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, that seems to have exhausted our questions, so we'll go back to displaying the recommendation. So there's no further questions for Mr. Can. So thank you for your presentation. If you could return to the gallery. So matters arising.
Through you, Mr. Chair. The matters that were raised by the objector include multi-unit development being out of character with the area. This area is not covered by a heritage overlay. It's in a neighbourhood residential zone. There are examples of multiple unit developments within the immediate area, and there's nothing to prohibit multi-unit development within this area. The objector raised that the proposal was an overdevelopment of the site, and I'd like to note that the proposal has a site coverage of 41.7% and Res Code allows 60% site coverage. It has a permeable area of 35.9% and Res Code requires 20%, so it's exceeding that permeable area. It complies with Res Code standards in relation to setback, building height, overshadowing. It's fully Res Code compliant with the exception of the suggested conditions relating to overlooking. So it's certainly not an overdevelopment of the site. In terms of the garden setting that the objector raised would be compromised by the proposed development. The proposed development is set back 8.8 metres from the front boundary and retains the existing tree. It has a common driveway that runs along the boundary of the site, and this is actually a response that's encouraged by our neighbourhood character precinct statement, which gives preference to units set one behind the other. The front setback is totally uninhibited by car parking structures with that common driveway. So this outcome is something that's specifically sought after in our precinct statements. In relation to visual bulk, the proposal exceeds the requirements of Res Code and is set back well from the site's boundaries. It allows at the rear a spacious area of secluded private open space of approximately 66 square metres, noting that Res Code requires 25 with a minimum of 3. So it's a very spacious backyard, and council's arborists have suggested conditions relating to canopy tree planting, and those suggested conditions from council's arborist have been included in council's recommendation. In terms of the overshadowing, Res Code requires council to use the equinox as the measure, noting that in summer the shadows would actually be less, and the proposal is very compliant with Res Code. In relation to the colour, the colours suggested, council can't, because there's no heritage overlay, can't suggest colours that there's no external paint controls, there's no colours that might be preferenced, particularly given that it's going to be associated with dwelling 2, which will have limited visibility from the street. So colours are something that we can't really include. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillors, that takes us to questions, and Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Chair. I might use this time to say I'll foreshadow a motion when the time comes, but I do have a couple of questions for officers, if I can. First one is our presenters this evening showed an image of their backyard with the swimming pool seeking another canopy tree in the back of the proposed development. Is that possible? Is there room to do such a thing?
The setback from the rear boundary of the ground floor in that position that was referred to is 4 metres, and that's consistent with Council's arborist recommendations for area for a canopy tree, so that would be possible, yes.
Okay, thank you. Follow-up question to that, and this is the perils of canopy trees sometimes. Will that contribute to overshadowing of that property?
Yeah, look, it may do. We haven't done that assessment, and it is hard to sort of say, but potentially if it was to get very large, and yeah,
Okay.
potentially.
Thank you. Second question is the other one relates to the trellis. Is there an issue with providing a trellis to a certain height? Do we need to think about a height that's suitable?
Generally speaking, we would say a 500 mil trellis would be most appropriate along a boundary. Boundary.
Thank you. So I'll foreshadow a motion. Thanks, Chair.
Yes. Next question is from Councillor Franco.
Thanks. A couple of questions. In relation to the colours, I've noted the advice that we may not have powers to mandate colours as such, but do we know if the applicant or the owners would be willing to entertain changes to the colour scheme that would provide more appropriate relief, or has that been put to the owners, and have we had any advice in relation to that? Because they may be willing to accept that.
I have spoken to the permit applicant who was reluctant to change the colour scheme, particularly to an earthy green, given that that's not part of the design palette. They were receptive to a trellis and additional planting though, but they weren't receptive to that colour change. And I think council would have a difficult time upholding that condition should it be appealed.
And in relation to the trellis, is there anything that would preclude us going up, say, a metre rather than simply half a metre above the existing fence line on the western boundary?
Having a metre would make it quite a high fence, given it's already a 1.8 metre high fence. It's not an ideal planning outcome, and I think that a 500 mil trellis is more acceptable and appropriate, but there's nothing to prohibit that. It's just not a great outcome.
Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Chair. A question along the lines of Councillor Franco with regard to, do you think the applicant would be agreeable to consider an evergreen tree or selection of tree that might help provide more of a permanent blockading time as the tree does grow to maturity, and also the size of established trees, if we can have an indication of if a recommendation could be made as to putting in a tree that is already semi-established, or trees that are semi-established?
My conversations with the permit applicant, I'm sure they would be very open to having an evergreen tree there. As a council standard, we require that the trees are 2 metres when planted, and that's with the advice of our arborist that's the ideal sort of height for a tree to be replanted in. So I'm sure that there would be no concerns from the permit applicant to have such a condition.
Thank you for that. I understand, sorry, Mr Chair, I was just going to say, I do understand for the tree's viability, it's important to put an appropriate sized tree to enable the root system to grow, so thank you.
Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. Officers mentioned that we are requiring extra tree planting, I believe. Should we seek to have another one added, does that conflict with what we've already requested? How will that fit in and be accommodated in a way that seems sensible.
There's a large area of secluded private open space at the rear, spanning 4 metres to 5.5 metres, so there would be enough room. There is a permit condition that's currently on there that suggested that in the secluded private open space of dwelling 2, a canopy tree with a height and canopy of 8 metres. So we could, there is enough room for another tree and the usable space as well.
Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Galt.
Through you, Chair, I've just a couple of questions. There's been much made of the compliance with Res Code, and I've got no doubt that it is fully compliant. But also the objectors have raised an issue about the neighbourhood character study, in particular reference to that area, and some of the guidelines about open space, trees and things like that. Has that been fully complied with, or is that totally subservient to Res Code?
The neighbourhood character precinct statement is referenced in the planning scheme, so an assessment has been done in the officer's report and it's fully compliant with all the design objectives within the neighbourhood character precinct.
Through you, Chair, just a final question. There was an email that came in, I think today, from a number of objectors that live locally. It's late in the piece, I do realise, and all the points may have been addressed in the objections presented tonight, but have we taken into consideration the objections in that email?
Yes, we have.
Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I do understand that it will be compliant with the planning scheme, but one of the slides that was put up previously showed rather large windows overlooking a backyard. And now I understand there'll be provisions for that, but I'm just sort of thinking about the future as well. Are there ways to have a much more solid way to keep that privacy, I guess, or the sense of privacy? I think you were talking about the western elevation. Where there was a pool, so I'm not sure which elevation it is. I'm not looking at the plans here.
I think it's the western elevation. So those windows have been screened to 1.7 metres with opaque screening. So those windows are compliant with Res Code.
That seems to have exhausted the questions, so I'm going to return to Councillor Thompson, who foreshadowed a motion.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm hoping the officers may be able to assist me with a alternative recommendation to the officers. So it's the officers' recommendation with the inclusion of a trellis, and I'm going to test this with councillors, to 500 millimetres, and an additional canopy tree in a position as described by the resident, and with officers to confirm that. However, with the canopy tree, I believe that canopy tree should be in accordance with what's recommended with the other canopy trees, so it's not dissimilar.
We'll just wait until we've got that up on the screen before I invite a seconder.
So just to confirm with officers, the B originally said 1 canopy tree and now we're increasing that to 2. That's the case?
Yes, that's the case. And further down, there's a landscape plan as well that's referenced as well for the 2 canopy trees.
So through you, Chair, that's the motion I'd like to test with colleagues.
Thank you. So I'm looking for a seconder to Councillor Thompson's motion. Councillor Franco, you've got your light on.
I'm happy to second the motion, but I'd foreshadow 2 things. Firstly, I think there's an error in the wording there, and secondly, I want to foreshadow an amendment.
Let's take it one at a time.
So a 500 millimetre freestanding trellis. It's not a 500 millimetre. It's a freestanding trellis to be constructed along the western boundary. The first 500
it's
millimetre.
a little bit repetitive, isn't it? It mentions it twice. Just before we put that back up, there's a suggestion that the Australian suggestion maybe it should say.
If I've got an amendment, are you sure? All right, you second it, I'll amend it.
Just going to revert to Councillor Thompson first.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I think that reads fine. Same intent.
Sure.
Thank you.
Does that address the first point you were raising, Councillor Franco?
It does.
Right. So, for clarification, you had a second issue.
Yes, well, look, it may not be appropriate for me to second the motion because I do have an amendment, and the amendment will relate to the height of the trellis and also to the colour of the second story. So, depending on whether...
just for the sake of testing that question, what did you have in mind in terms of the height of the trellis?
A minimum, I would change the words to have a height of a minimum 1,000 millimetres above the boundary fence.
That's not, is that something you'd contemplate, Councillor Thompson, or not? If not, I'll seek a different seconder.
The problem I have, Chair, is that I don't know the residents' views on a trellis of 1 metre above the fence. Only we can't defer to ask that question of the resident unless we can.
I'm probably willing to entertain that if no councillor objects.
It would assist me with whether I can accept.
Just help my memory. The relevant property owner was
Mr. Camp.
Mr. Can. Mr. Can, are you still here? Could you just come up to the lectern again, please? And could you express your view about the height of the trellis so that councillors can take your view into account?
Yeah, assuming he was referring to me as the owner on the western side. I guess the issue that I have, whether it's 500 millimetres or 1,000 millimetres, is barely going to do very much about obscuring that property. We already have a trellis on our side of the fence, which probably goes to that height.
Which height is that? Are we talking the 5 or the 1,000?
Well, it would be, it's slightly taller than 1.8 metres above the fence line at the moment. So the existing trellis already comes above that, of which there is a climbing rose that sits on top of that. So you're pretty much negating any benefit whatsoever. It would have to be higher than that to be of any real benefit. So then,
just so that I can wrap this up, are you expressing a preference for a metre versus half a metre?
Yeah. To be honest, I don't think we care about having a trellis there. I don't think that realistically makes a difference to us.
Okay.
It's the tree that really would, a canopy tree will make a difference because it will grow and it will actually make a difference.
And the canopy tree is dealt with in clause B. So you're sort of deeply ambivalent whether clause A is included or not. Is, I think, sums it up.
Well, I mean, the issue from our proposal was we want you to actually reject the whole proposal.
We understand that, but that's not the question I'm asking.
Yeah, I know, and you're asking me a question so that, I mean, to answer your question that you've asked, the trellis is redundant for us. So
yep.
Clause A is redundant.
Okay.
Doesn't achieve anything.
That's
canopy
helpful.
Tree does achieve
yep.
something.
All right. Thank you for that.
Thank you for your indulgence, Chair, to do that. I'll leave it at 500 millimetres, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I think I'd called on Councillor Hollingsworth.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr Chair.
So the only question for you is, are you prepared to second Councillor Thompson's motion or not?
I am prepared to second, but just wanted to seek whether Councillor Thompson would include the word evergreen canopy trees, which would help give all year round screening to the residents. And the reason I say that is deciduous.
Okay, I think it speaks for itself at this point. So, Councillor Thompson, yes or no?
Again, Chair, as I sort of foreshadowed before, I'm not sure what other trees are suggested, and I'd rather leave the officers to negotiate that.
That's what normally would happen anyway, isn't it?
Through you, Chair, I think that's eminently sensible. It allows council's arborist to actually look at the site. We know that there is a 4 to 5 metre setback for the dwelling, and we need to get the right species so that there's 2 trees that can actually survive in that space.
That's fine. Thank you, Mr Wickramasinghe. So, seconding or not, Councillor Hollingsworth, as it stands? If not, I'm going to move on to someone else.
I just wanted to clarify.
No,
we didn't agree on evergreen. Is that my?
No, the motion is as it's displayed on the screen.
Okay. No, I won't second.
Thank you. Is there someone else? Councillor Watson.
Happy to second.
Thank you. For the sake of assisting Councillor Thompson, is there any opposition at this juncture? Some, Councillor Thompson. So I'll hand to you to speak to your motion.
Thanks, Chair. I do understand that there may be someone who wants to move an amendment to what I'm suggesting, but what I will do is recommend this to all councillors. And I know this is a challenge for our residents when we see a development like this, but the rights of the developer here, when it complies fully with Res Code, in fact, as the officers suggested, it more than just complies, it sort of goes well beyond what Res Code asks for. And this is the challenge that we've got, because given this full compliance that this development has, if we were to sit here and were actually to reject this, I'm afraid to say that our community would be poorer for that, because VCAT would clearly find this to be a project worthy of supporting, and it would actually eliminate us to make some meaningful but small improvements, which is what item A and B are doing. So by rejecting this, we don't even give the opportunity for those two to actually occur. So councillors, as hard as this is, this development fully complies. I recommend that we support this with the inclusion of those 2 additional points. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Franco.
Chair, I'd like to move an amendment, if I may, and I'm not sure what the appropriate...
What is your amendment?
I'd like to move an amendment that the first floor of dwelling 2 be finished in an earthy green colour to the satisfaction of the responsible authority. So adding that as a C, or as a new C.
That's the entirety of the amendment?
That's the entirety
Okay,
of the
I'll just see if we
amendment.
can get that put up. And Mr. Storer.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'd just like to assist councillors in relation to the proposition being put forward by Councillor Franco, and Mr Mitchell might confirm this, but it's my understanding there are no planning controls on this site which would give council the ability to seek control over colour. And if that is the case, and you are to include that in a notice of determination to grant a permit, that condition would be invalid. So the consequence of taking that step is to set up false expectations that council in some way is going to be able to control the colour when it cannot. It also has the impact of placing an applicant in position where it would need to go to VCAT in order to have that condition determined to be invalid. So I might just seek some feedback from Mr Mitchell as to whether there is a planning control in place on this site which gives control over colour.
Mr Mitchell.
Thank you, and through you, Mr Chair. As Ms Caparoso has already confirmed, there are no planning controls over colours in this location. Thank you.
Okay, so...
Can I ask a question in relation to that?
Yes, of
the office.
Sure, yes.
Is it not the case that in determining this application, we are approving, assuming we approve this development, the colours that are used and the final finishes? And in that very act, are we not therefore approving the colour, and don't we have the discretion to consider what colours may be more appropriate in terms of the amenity on neighbouring residents?
I think there's a distinction to be drawn here between making an assessment against neighbourhood character policy. So we require materials and colours to be submitted with planning applications, and that helps us do an assessment against neighbourhood character. Neighbourhood character is generally assessed from what you can see, so from the streetscape. Here, as I understand it, the issue is one of visual bulk and trying to address that, so a different issue, and as viewed from the rear of the site. So again, a different issue. I think that it would be very difficult if this went to VCAT to be able to maintain a condition that requires changes to colours because of that reason. As I've said, there's no actual colour controls. That means, you know, again, if people want to paint their houses in this area, they don't actually need any permission from the council to do that. So, you know, that adds to the difficulty of specifying, yep, it's got to be this particular, you know, a change to this particular colour, and the reason for that is to, you know, minimise the impact on a next door neighbour. Thanks.
So I see that Councillor Sinfield's light's on. I'm just going to inquire for what purpose, whether it's to ask a question or some other purpose.
To debate the motion that is on the screen.
Okay, so I'm just going to pause there and confirm that because I've allowed Councillor Franco to ask a question, are there any questions, Councillor Thompson? So I'm going to entertain any questions that relate to that point, given that Councillor Franco has asked and we've heard from 2 or 3 officers.
No question, just procedural. Has Councillor Franco got a seconder for this?
No, I've paused to entertain questions if there are any. That's the sole reason, and then I'm going to revert to Councillor Franco with a question, and then we'll see from there. So, Councillor Franco, my question to you is, you've heard the officer advice. Are you pursuing your motion or are you withdrawing it?
I'd like to put the motion forward if it gets a seconder.
Okay. So, councillors, I'm going to see if there is a seconder for Councillor Franco's motion. And I will remind you that you've heard advice from officers, but of course, notwithstanding that advice, Council has the ability to lead itself into error and decide as it pleases, and it's then the situation that another tribunal would correct that. But
Chair.
So, is there a seconder?
Can I speak to why someone might second it at this point or not?
No, I'm not going to give that much latitude, but let's see if there's a seconder. So the motion lapses for want of a seconder, which takes us back to the original debate, Councillor Thompson's motion to which he had spoken. So I'm looking for any further speakers. Now, of course, Councillor Franco, you still have the ability to speak to this. Councillor Watson was the seconder, and your light is on, so I'm going to move across to you, Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. I might have missed something in the officers talking to this motion. Can I ask a question of officers about item B?
I'll hear the question.
Has there been an assessment done by the arborist as to whether the space there will allow for 2 canopy trees? Did I miss that?
The answer was yes.
All right, thank you very much. I'll thank you very much. I will speak no further at this stage.
Okay, so you're reserving a right. So then, are there any other speakers? Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to comment that I don't not support this motion. I just wanted to raise a concern with regard to the fact that deciduous trees can actually be naked for 6 months of the year. And I think for the objective to serve the concern of the neighbouring resident, evergreen would give them a greater degree of comfort. But I'll leave it there. Thank you.
And without entering the debate at this juncture, I think the advice from officers was that they would look to specify appropriate trees. So that may well be the outcome, but it was it didn't have that degree of specificity so as to provide the optimum outcome. Is how I understood that. Councillor Franco.
Can I speak?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. I think the issue here that we're grappling with is as a consequence of the restrictive or minimal setbacks to the rear and to the side that are required under the planning controls. And in this case, we face a situation where the main area of amenity and peaceful green space is at the rear of, and to the side of some of the properties. And I think the images that were put up by Minister Can told everything in terms of the impact on the residents in that neighbouring area, where other residents have their dwellings set back from the rear fence. But I recognise that it is in accords with the planning controls, everything, so it's understandable. But I do see this impact in other locations, and I'll just flag that for council as well, I've seen this in some of our natural reserves backing onto Gardeners Creek, where front setbacks are always given priority, and we have significant front setbacks, but then you go from the rear and you look at the properties and the height and the scale where they impact on the public domain and the enjoyment of open space, and that's happening. So it's not just happening here. We're seeing an example of it here, but it's happening elsewhere, and I appreciate that we're limited in what we can do. I do think it's appropriate to attempt to tackle the colours, because if it were our backyards and you had to face and look at a particular colour that's imposed by a neighbour, it's not visible to the street, but the very residents that are directly impacted, this is what I was trying to pitch, but I understand that that motion's failed, but it's not the residents out in the street that have to look, it's the neighbours who are facing this development, and it's fairly sheer and it's up, you know. So I do think the tree is an improvement, the additional canopy tree. I think that'll improve things, but I think it would have been better if the owner and the developer of the new property took into account, and I just encourage this, to what the views experienced by the neighbours, and have a sense of neighbourliness and consider the impact on their neighbours and the colours that they choose. So look, maybe that's an appeal. Whilst it won't go through here, I just appeal to the owners. Think of the neighbours and what they are looking at, and maybe work with them to try and find some mutually more satisfactory outcome in terms of colours. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Councillor Sinfield.
Thanks, Chair. I think planning applications like this are often overthought, I think, and we're looking at an application here which is 2 dwellings on a lot, not 4, not 5, not 10, and we may not love it, and no, it's not next door to me, but I think we really need to be careful with giving any false sense of hope to the neighbours and to the other residents in the street as to what we can and can't achieve here. We've spent an awful long time tonight, I haven't looked at the clock, debating matters that are simply beyond our control. I can't tell you what colour tie to wear next week, and I can't tell my neighbour what colour he can or can't paint his house. I'm not in love with the idea of putting 2 canopy trees in a small rear yard, because I think that's likely to affect the amenity of the residents in that property down the track, particularly if they're evergreen and it's winter. So the amount of sunlight they're going to get into their property is then impacted if we prescribe that in fact they're evergreen. So I'm certainly happy to leave that up to the arborists to provide their best advice on that, but I think we're heading down a path of being overly prescriptive and ultimately asking for a date at VCAT. And what a date at VCAT results in is the council incurring additional costs, which are then passed on to the ratepayers, and those costs, while each individual case won't elevate the price of rates in this particular street, broadly across the municipality, these costs that can be avoided through the months of work that the officers do in the lead up to this point of reaching somewhat of a mediated outcome and a compromise, does result in reduced expenditure on other things across the municipality, be it an upgrade to a road or a playground or anything else you might seek to use the finite expenditure on. So I think we really need to consider what we are and are not willing to debate in this chamber, and 1 or 2 trees or a colour of a house is something that I think is beyond our scope. So I'm not going to die in a ditch over a second tree, but I'm not in love with the idea, and I'm happy to support the motion.
All right, before I return to Councillor Thompson, is there any other speaker? No. Councillor Thompson, your right of reply.
Thanks, Chair. I'll try and keep this brief. This proposal fully complies. That's where it starts. What we've got up on the screen is 2 additional fairly minor inclusions into the planning, a permit which the proponent applicant has said to officers that they'll accept. And that's, I guess, a goodwill gesture here as well. The additional tree sits not in the gazetted private open space of Unit 2, so it shouldn't have any great impact. A 500mm trellis on top of a 1.9 metre paling fence will allow that to grow, that canopy tree to grow in time. This is not planning is an art, it's not an accurate science, so this is really the best way forward for all of us. I think, we'd love to think that we could just knock this on the head and think it would be the best outcome for the community, but it won't be. And that's the challenge that we've got here. So I ask that you all support this, including those that foreshadowed that they wouldn't, because I think this is the right way forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I'll put that motion. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. That takes us to item 3.3, 979 Toorak Road, Camberwell. That report will be presented by Erin McCarthy, Coordinator of Statutory Planning, and Scott Lipscomb, is Senior Traffic Engineer, is also in attendance in the event there are any matters relating to traffic. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Mr Chair. The application at 979 Toorak Road, Camberwell proposes to use the existing dwelling for the purpose of a childcare centre. The application received 24 objections following the advertising period. The subject site currently contains a single-storey detached dwelling on the corner of Toorak Road and Athelston Road. There is an existing driveway with access via the side street, which is Athelston Road. The proposed childcare centre is proposed as a small-scale Montessori-style learning centre with a maximum of 22 children and 2 staff. It is proposed to operate between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Monday to Friday. The proposed centre will provide 4 on-site car spaces, 2 for staff and 2 for pick-up drop-off spaces, which fully complies with the number of parking spaces required under Clause 5206 of the Burundara Planning Scheme. All spaces are able to be accessed via a single manoeuvre, and vehicles will be able to exit the site in a forward direction. Appropriate noise attenuation measures will be employed in the form of a 2.1 metre high acoustic fence along all boundaries adjacent to residential properties, which will limit noise spill from the childcare centre. The outdoor play space will be located in the front setback, predominantly interfacing with Toorak Road and the existing driveway at 981 Toorak Road. A permit condition has been recommended to alter the materials of the proposed front fence to ensure it is in keeping with the character of the area. A permit condition is also recommended to provide an acoustic report and any necessary modifications to the existing building to ensure that the amenity of the adjacent and nearby residential properties is maintained. It is acknowledged that all of the objections received raise concerns with traffic and car parking in the surrounding area, given the proximity of the service station, Camberwell South Primary School and Bowen Gardens, and the fact that Athelston Road is a busy connector road between Camberwell Road and Toorak Road. With regard to traffic and safety in car parking, Council's traffic engineers are supportive of the proposal and consider there is adequate capacity on Athelston Road to cater for additional traffic generated by the proposed centre. The engineers are also of the view that despite the existing congestion that may already occur in the area, the additional traffic movements anticipated from the centre may be accommodated at the intersection and not cause undue additional impact to the immediate surrounding road network. It is further noted that generally with childcare centres, the peak period will extend over a longer period, which reduces the intensity of parking demands and assists in this aspect. The on-site parking provision of car parking fully satisfies the statutory requirement and is considered that there is adequate on-street parking capacity along the site frontage and in relevant proximate locations to cater for the anticipated parking demands. Further details of the assessment undertaken and relevant referrals are contained within the Delegate's report. For the reasons outlined, it is respectfully recommended that the Office's recommendation to issue a notice of decision to grant a planning permit subject to the conditions outlined is adopted.
Thank you. And 1B or not 1B, that is the question. We're just renumbering them. Yes?
Yes, thank you.
And so it'll just be 1A and B, so C will become A. And in the top line, of course, it's the Urban Planning Delegated Committee. So we'll make those adjustments. We have 3 speakers for this item, 2 against and 1 in favour. The first speaker is Mr. Greg Price. And as per last time, if you could commence with your name and address, please.
Thanks very much, councillors. My name is Greg Price. I believe I still reside at 2A Breena Road in Glen Iris. I'm on the fence about this proposal, and obviously there have been a number of objections. There's the whole traffic aspect. Looking at the overall design of it, I'm not sure whether, from a usable perspective, the 2 spaces for customers at the rear of the centre are overly valuable, because essentially think about cars going up and down the street, and will people know whether to go in and use the car spaces as opposed to not going, because there are side fences, there's visibility things. It's like, from an aerial perspective, it looks fine. I think it might be tight getting it out of 1 and 2, but I'm not sure whether it's practical in itself. My larger issues is actually the wisdom of the Centron there, and there were officers' statements saying, well, there'll be Montessori program run there, which I'm not sure whether having Montessori or an alternative program run there is going to be a permit condition or not, as opposed to it will just be any kind of childcare centre. But the noise aspects, the play space for the children is out the front. It's on a 4-lane road. That's Toorak Road. There's trucks going up and down. So I didn't really see anything that addresses the noise and the pollution aspects, and hence, there's the whole wisdom of like, why are we putting a childcare centre with the child's play space out in the front yard? And I'm not sure what the fencing will end up being like, where there's a petrol station on one side and a 4-lane road on the other. And I've got to say, it's one of Melbourne's busiest roads. So I'm not sure how that should be addressed, but I'm just not convinced by the wisdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a question from Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Mr Price. Are you aware of any other childcare facilities on Toorak Road?
I know one on Glen Iris Road, but I can't think of any along there.
Just thought you might have known if there are any others that will suffer the same plight as what you've suggested for this one.
All the childcare centres that I know of, they tend to be in, buried away further back, near parks and things like that, obviously. But or the ones, say, on Glen Iris Road that's, round the corner sort of thing. It's it's set further back, and, I think there's also an issue with the door out to the car, to the car park from one of the rooms. It's like, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Price.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Mr. John Lobley. And if you could commence your presentation with your name and address, please.
My name's John Lobley. I live at 92 Athelstan Road, which is directly opposite the driveway of the property of the proposal. Our main concern is with the traffic volume and the assessment of that was made of it back in 2018. We're concerned about the amount of traffic, volume that's there now, let alone especially with the school pickup and drop-off times, which will coincide, I believe, with the same times as the childcare centre. The other issue with the traffic is the assessment that I read about was done in 2018, which is 3 years ago, and it was done outside number 63, which is 260 metres up the road, away from where this conjunction is, where all this traffic is going to concentrate. And I do identify that in that assessment of traffic and the commercial industries around it, with the service station, the shops across the road, that there is a concentration of traffic there anyway. And the mentioning that through traffic that it was only going to be a minor impact, I don't think is actually that accurate, because no one's actually done an up-to-date study of the area at the times proposed. Over and above that, like I said, that assessment was done 3 years ago. We have trouble getting in and out of our driveway as it is with the current volume of traffic, which we just find very difficult to deal with on a daily basis. However, if there was to be any modification of access to the property, there are suggestions of changing the parking restrictions on that side of the road to a 2 or 3 or 4 minute drop-off period, where the potentially, it says in the report, 17 drop-off and 15 pick-up. Don't know where that number comes from, but there's potentially 22 cars that are going to be lining up to pick up kids and drop off kids at particular times of the day, where are those 22 cars going to go, with the keeping in mind that the age group is 3 to 6 years old. These kids can't walk very far, so it's not like they can park up around the block and walk their kids down because they're young kids. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Councillor Franco.
Thanks, John. In relation to the parking restrictions which you've mentioned, what is your view on the parking restriction? I don't think you actually expressed it. You mentioned the restrictions in the report. Do you think they should change, stay the same?
If you want to try and resolve the concentration of cars at those times, and you know, the car parks next to where the potential parents could park the cars to wait in a queue to drive in to those 2 car spaces inside to pick their kids up, is a 2-hour parking zone. Now, those parks are going to be full all day long. They're full. So where are the parents going to do? They're probably going to double park and wait in a queue and take their turn to go in. And if every car takes 5 minutes, 22 kids, that's an hour and 50 minutes of time where people could be delayed picking up their children. So what they do at the Richmond Primary School is they have a pick-up drop-off zone that has a 3-minute time limit. Keeps them moving. Maybe they've got to change the way they do things, but just the current situation with it's just not going to accommodate, you know, that number of cars at those times.
And one other question, if that's all right. You mentioned you're having trouble getting in and out of your driveway as it is. Could you just explain what type of trouble, what sort of challenges?
On the opposite side of the road where our house is, the parking, there's no parking between Toorak Road and our driveway, and there was sort of one space there for a while, but that was removed. So all the parking comes up the street and heads in a northerly direction. So what happens is when people come around the corner to come up Athelston Road at the busy times, the cars are wide enough, and we're all getting bigger cars these days with SUVs and what have you, that people are reluctant for 2 cars to pass each other within the space allowed with 2 cars parked on either side. So what the people do coming around the corner is they stop in front of our driveway. I can't get into my driveway. I'm one of the ones trying to turn in, so that stopped all the flow behind. He stopped all the flow going in. So I've got to go around the block again to have another crack at it, and hopefully there's no one there when I come back. So it just impacts on our accessibility to our property, and plus people parking across our driveway and waiting for their children, not letting us exit.
Thank you. And I've got a question from Councillor Bigger.
Actually, my question was the same as Councillor Franco's. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that exhausts our questions. So thank you. If you could return to the gallery. And I have been handed a couple more forms. The next speaker is Mrs. Debbie Lobley. If you could come forward, please. You'll need to just come forward. We can't hear you, sorry.
We'd all hoped to have one spokesperson who was going to speak on our behalf, but that spokesperson was only allowed 3 minutes.
That's correct. So would you like to have your 3 minutes now?
Could we change the order of which ones will speak? Because we've actually had to split it all up into...
All right, well, who's proposing to speak next? You kind of need to mention this to the officers. So
sorry, we didn't know. I didn't even know I had to hand the forms in, so sorry.
All right, so who was what? If you've given a form up and you're the next speaker, come forward, please, and then we'll do it that way.
Thanks so much.
No problem. If you could just give me your name.
Good evening. Adam Joyce of
Yes.
985 Toorak Road.
Okay, you're on. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm here tonight to speak on behalf of a collective of 45 residents regarding this proposal. I would like the record to state that we've asked for an adjournment of this matter as 6 business days to discuss and review the officers'
Just bear in mind you've got 3 minutes. You probably best
I will move quickly. We accept that the regulations have been met and that the by the applicant, but we are requesting that council look at the impact upon our current residents and our enjoyment of the area. Our main concern would be the increasing traffic congestion of Athelstan Road. The engineer's report was completed in 2018. I'm not sure if anyone is aware of this, but Camberwell South Primary has permanently changed the flow of their traffic. Parents are not permitted to enter from Toorak Road down Peat Avenue. All parents must travel in a northerly direction up Peat Avenue, pick up their children and then perform a left turn at Toorak Road. This has been for 12 months now. The consequence is that all parents there has been a huge uptake in the parking at the bottom of Athelstan Road, impacting upon everyone who is living in this area. We would also raise the fact that Camberwell South has increased their capacity substantially over this time. It's been recognised that outdoor spaces in the community have increased usage in the period following COVID, and visibly to us residents, this has continued. So we would argue that the agent of change here is 979 Toorak Road, that they be liable to perform an updated traffic engineer's report to review the impact that these traffic changes have taken place. We are not arguing that 22 residents will increase above the capacity in 2018, but the actual capacity or the utilisation of the road has increased drastically since that time. As discussed earlier, 22 children and 2 staffing at any time. We feel that this may be a convenient understatement of the number of staff required. At an 11-to-1 ratio, two staff at any time would not allow any breaks to be taken. It would not allow staff to remove themselves from the room to prepare meals, as would be the case required in a long daycare. 2 staff car parks on site is inadequate, and that would leave only 2 other for parents. From a practical point of view, the time that the car park is full would be, as discussed earlier, would be full for most of the afternoon. We also feel that there is a safety element in this street and that the council should be assessing the need for a manned crossing, as there is a safety concern for those leaving school, leaving a childcare and leaving the park. Many of these concerns could be addressed by a traffic engineer's report, and we would also ask council to review the minimum on-site requirements and also for an adjournment on this decision if possible.
Thank you, Mr Joyce. I'll just see there is a question from Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Mr Joyce, for your presentation. I'm picking up on the comment about the main crossing. Are you talking about a main crossing across Toorak Road?
No, there is one there already, one that crosses Athelstan Road.
Oh, across Athelstan Road. Thank you. Cheers.
And there's also a question from Councillor Franco.
Yes, I just wanted to be clear. In your view, the increase in traffic and congestion has already occurred to some degree through other attractors in the area, such as the primary school. Is that correct?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. And so the current traffic engineer's report does not affect the actual utilisation of this road.
So it might be more appropriate, rather than to push the onus on the applicant of the childcare premise, it might be more appropriate for council, might it not, to assess the overall traffic impacts and look at the safety and parking and amenity issues in relation to the broader precinct and all the users that are generating traffic.
Look, I'm not sure of the exact obligations. My feeling would be that there has been a request for the permit to be changed for the current usage, and that liabilities should fall to the individual who would like to operate that business rather than all individual ratepayers.
I think that exhausts the questions. Thank you for your presentation. Mrs Lobley, I think you must be the only speaker left opposed, so...
Mine in as well, and we also, Michelle Hines.
Oh yes, you're marked as being in favour.
No, I'm not in favour.
All right, well that's your form, but I'll take your word for it. Come on forward, and if you can start with your name and address, thanks.
My name's Michelle Hines. I'm at 80 Athelston Road. Clearly, this is a very knee-jerk reaction to a very short time that we've had to prepare, and we're all working full-time and trying to develop the best case we can, so apologies. We recognise that we're not opposed to the business development or to an additional childcare facility. There is currently 7 in the local area, but we're very conscious about the hazards that they produce. What we'd like to talk about is we recognise that childcare is within the jurisdiction of the Department of Education, and whilst the application may meet the requirement of the 11:1 ratio of appropriately educated staff to children on paper, we question the functionality of this. The Council has stipulated that only 2 staff, paid or unpaid, are allowed on the site at any one time, and therefore there's a subsequent provision of car parking for only 2 car spots. We question, is a centre operational with only 2 staff in total? And that's what my colleague had also said, when you consider everything that has to be done during the day. Therefore, the consequence is that the car park 3 and 4 would be used for car parking, and therefore this whole in-out for pick-up drop-off into a single entry exit onto Athelston Road is just a disaster waiting to happen. We also query the 2 toilets for 22 kids in the relation to the open. It's really far from the open space. We query the 152 metre square of outdoor play area for 22 kids. This is the very minimum required by the department. The licensee must provide 7 square metres for each child. So 7 times 22 is 154, and that's the minimum. So therefore, if you had an outdoor cubby or you had a fixed equipment store, a pot plant, the provisions wouldn't be met. We've also required that on the southern and the western wall there'll be a double brick fence. This would eat into that 154 metre square, therefore not meeting the requirements. As a private importantly, in the last 10 years, we're aware of a car that's gone straight through the front fence and crashed through. Another one's landed in the front yard. And I personally am aware of turning out of Athelston Road into Toorak Road. I've had an accident myself. It is so difficult, so dangerous now, and it's going to only get worse with additional uses in that one section. While this business is a private company, is it fair that given that the shortage of space, 22 kids in this small area, is it fair that a private company would use Ratepayer Park as potentially a regular quasi-classroom breakout area? How safe is crossing Athelston Road with 23 to 4-year-old kids? Waste storage, we believe that 22 kids waste is very underestimated, and
I'll need to stop you there, thank you. So there are no questions, so if you could return to the gallery, and Mrs. Lobley, it seems to be your turn now.
Thank you. I'm Debbie Lobley. I'm also at number 92 Athelston Road. Michelle didn't quite get through all of her things. So the waste storage and pickup. We believe that the waste from a 22-child childcare business has been underestimated, to use council services fortnightly. Waste must be stored. Where is it going to be stored? And what about the smell? Further, waste bins will be required and perhaps be set up in the car parking area, reducing turn cycle access, or on the nature strip. Furthermore, we ask why an environmental audit overlay isn't required. Kids playing in a confined spot right next to a very busy main road with a petrol station across the road with fumes, pollution, etc. In summary, from Michelle, the application barely meets the required standards on which the decision by council is endorsed. The application has been made. There is much opportunity for non-compliance. Should the business be successful? Who knows? But the landscape has been changed and the precedent set, and an accident waiting to happen, especially right there on that intersection. we were actually, from my part of my speech, we're actually all appalled at the time frame that we were given to respond to this. It was 10 days, but not all of us have received the email. By the time it's taken for us to circulate the email, get together, gather our responses, we've not had enough time really to pursue this as well as we would like. So we are asking for a delay in your decision so that we can confidently and
the decision is being made tonight, so if there's anything that we hear that, but if there's anything further that you want to present, you really do need to use that time.
Okay, thank you. In your agenda, the discretionary uses of development in residential areas is to avoid clusters of non-residential activity in residential areas, to encourage new non-residential uses to locate on sites previously used or developed for non-residential purposes, as opposed to sites most recently used for residential purposes. In clause 32.09-13, the decision guidelines, whether the use or development is compatible with residential use, the safety, efficiency and amenity of effects to traffic to be generated by the proposal. What we request is an appeal to you to delay, please. We request a traffic data report, but to be taken at the intersection where the childcare centre is going to be. The one that was done in 2018 was done at number 63 and does not include the entering traffic from Range Street and Donabuang Street.
I need to stop you there. Thank you.
Thank you.
And there's no questions, so if you could return to the gallery and matters arising from officers, thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Mr Chair. In response to the concerns raised, with regard to the invitations to the meeting tonight, officers have confirmed that the email invitations were definitely sent to all objectors 10 days prior to the meeting, which is standard process for all meeting invitations. With regard to the traffic generation, it is noted that the most recent council obtained traffic data for Athelston Road was in April 2018, but council's engineers in their referral assessment of the application have applied the typical 3% growth per year, and that's been taken into consideration in the assessment of the application. So under council's traffic management policy and procedures for local access roads such as Athelston Road, the daily traffic volumes anticipated for a road such as that are anticipated for 3,000 vehicles per day. Applying the typical 3% growth for the current application equals an anticipated volume of 1,121 vehicles per day. So council's traffic engineers are of the view that there is ample capacity within the existing road network. With regard to the existing congestion that already occurs in the vicinity of the subject site, and particularly at the network peak school drop-off periods, the anticipated addition of 17 movements in the AM and 15 movements of vehicles in the PM for the childcare centre was considered by the engineers to be accommodated at the intersection and not considered to cause undue additional impact to the immediate road network. Also, it's noted that with regard to childcare centres, there is typically an extended peak period, given that there is no fixed starting time or pick-up time, unlike school times. Council's traffic engineers were also supportive of the car parking layout, and it is noted that the provision is fully compliant with the requirements of the Boroondara Planning Scheme. With regard to the specific regulations regarding child-to-educator ratios, room sizes, bathroom facilities and play areas, these are all specifically governed by the Department of Education and Training, and there is a separate regulatory process separate to the planning permit process that the applicant would be required to meet. With regard to the staff numbers that are outlined in the recommended conditions of permit, these were proposed by the applicant and will be controlled by permit condition. In the event there were to be any increases to the staff, there would be a requirement for an amendment to the planning permit in future. With regard to waste, the waste is appropriately managed by recommended permit conditions. The application was referred to Council's Waste and Services Department and they're fully supportive of the application. With regard to environmental audit concerns, it's noted that the site is not covered by an environmental audit overlay, so there is no planning basis to apply conditions which would be required for an environmental audit or a report. With regard to the potential to have a cluster of childcare centres in the area, it has been acknowledged that there are 6 childcare centres within a 1 kilometre radius of the subject site located in residential zones, but the centres are considered to be appropriately spaced and not create a cluster of centres. They are generally located along main roads where non-residential activity is consistent with residential areas and it can be expected. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you. Mr Storer.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I just thought it might be helpful to explain the purpose of councillors hearing submissions this evening in relation to this matter. And it is that for the residents who felt concerned because they thought they were here to actually make their case, that's not really the purpose of hearing submissions this evening. Councillors have the objections which have been lodged, and assuming that all the effort has been put into making the case of those objections, councillors have the information in front of them. So tonight is really only about highlighting the key points of the existing objections which have been lodged with councillors for their consideration and for the consideration of officers, of course, in the preparation of the report. So I just wanted to provide some sort of sense of balance, if you like, so residents understand that they haven't missed the opportunity to make their case. Their objections are there for that purpose. And tonight really only is to 3 minutes to have them emphasise the key points from those various objections, submissions for councillors to consider.
Thank you. So I'll move to questions from councillors. Councillor Watson.
Jim, sorry, Chair, could I please ask you to instruct the meeting to speak into the microphones? I'm struggling to hear,
Sure.
if you don't mind.
Sure, okay, if we can all be mindful of that. So I'm moving to questions. Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just speaking into this microphone. Through you to the officers, the applicants nominated 2 staff, is that correct?
Through you, Mr Chair, yes, that's correct.
Okay. What happens if the Department of Education says they require more than 2 staff given the ratio of student to supervisors? Where do we sit? Do we provide any, are we requesting any further car parks on the site?
Through you, Mr Chair. So, yes, currently we understand that the ratio, educator to children ratio is compliant with the regulations. If in the event those changed and there was a requirement for an additional staff member, there would be a requirement for an amendment to the permit, and then we would need to consider the car parking implications of that.
Okay, thank you. And I guess we can't, because I know a number of the resident presenters tonight have spoken about the ratios of 7 square metres per student in outdoor spaces, and I think there's 3.3 square metres indoor. We can't control that.
Can I just stop you there for a moment? Could I just ask all councillors except for Councillor Thompson to just switch off their...
Thanks, Chair. So, through our planning process, we can't actually assess the number of students nor the areas. So to assist those residents, that's not something that we can do as part of our planning application process.
Through you, Mr Chair, we did seek the views of Council's Family Services Department, and the department did review the areas that are contained on the plan, but we don't have specific control over the educator to student ratio, for example, or the specific play area. With regard to the specific amount provided, that is part of the Department of Education separate regulatory process.
Thank you for that. And the final question through you, Chair. We obviously, there seems to be a saturation of childcare centres in close proximity. There's 3 on Toorak Road within 300 metres. We can't control the number of childcare centres. This is a private enterprise, so it doesn't form part of our decision making, does it?
Through you, Mr Chair, there is a provision in Council's discretionary uses policy which does specifically talk about whether an application is creating a cluster of uses in an area. So that did form part of officers' assessment, and we formed the view that they are appropriately spaced and it's not creating a cluster in this instance.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. We'll have another go at queuing, so we'll just have to monitor. The sound system's a little bit suboptimal tonight. Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. My question relates to, I think the residents were talking about parking restrictions in the street that currently exist. So what I'm seeking is whether or not the staff, the applicant, would be eligible for parking permits that would allow them to overstay the restricted, I think they said 2 hours.
Thanks through you, Mr Chair. Perhaps I can help with this one. So firstly, it's important to note that the car parking provision on site is fully compliant. So that means that there's no actual permit trigger requesting a reduction in parking, and no assessment then of a reduction in parking or the need for more parking. In terms of whether there would be a parking permit issued, the council does have its policy, but that's a residential parking policy, so it's not quite the same thing. I think I'd have to take that on notice and get some advice from our civic services area as to how they might consider a request for a parking permit. But as I said, there's no actual requirement to park on street. The car parking is fully compliant.
If I can just add to that, Chair, I think Mr Mitchell's indicated what permits are available are residential parking permits. This site is fully compliant, so the prospects of council supporting any parking permits is unlikely.
Are we able to put a condition on that they wouldn't be eligible? Because it's, that...
It's usually a notation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is there any reason that there couldn't be such a notation?
Through you, Mr Chair, there couldn't be a condition. The Planning Environment Act only covers certain things. Parking permits are dealt with through separate legislation, and you can't control something controlled through separate legislation by putting as a condition on a planning permit. We do regularly put notes on planning permits. The notes aren't actually enforceable, they're for information only, that advise that for 3 or more units in accordance with the resident parking permit policy, that resident parking permits wouldn't be available for people. Those permits form part of vendor statements, so people can see that if they're purchasing a property, there's more than 3 or more units on a site, that they wouldn't be getting a resident parking permit.
I don't feel like I've entirely got the answer I was seeking. I'm just trying to restrict this a bit because really it wouldn't be resident.
Yeah, I think we
permits.
understand your question. Mr Storer.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I think the answer is if council wishes to place a note like that on this permit, then you pass a resolution saying so. It can't be a condition, as Mr Mitchell has said, but you could in fact include in the resolution that such a note be placed on the permit.
Perhaps in readiness, if officers could just prepare that notation so that if in the event that that's the will of the committee, then we'll have that at our disposal. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair.
Just trying to establish the order because I'd noticed Councillor Stavry had his light on earlier, but anyway, yeah.
Checking the order as opposed to my name, that's good to know. Thank you, Chair. My question for officers in relation to point 11 in the report on the top of page 2. Not dissimilar, I suppose, to Councillor Thompson's question earlier in relation to the staffing numbers on site. The sentence reads that the number of staff, proprietors and any person related to the proprietors working in the childcare centre or any other persons working in the childcare centre, whether paid or unpaid, must not exceed 2 at any one time. And I wonder whether there might be room for movement there to allow for things like after-hours cleaning and so forth, where the car spaces are not being used by parents, or where a staff meeting might need to be held, where 3 cars or 4 cars or 4 people might need to be present, so that they can use that business location for such purposes, but it wouldn't conflict with the drop-off and pick-up of children and create any additional problem for traffic in the area. It just seems an overly prescriptive clause.
Thank you. Through you, Mr Chair. If councillors are of the mind to want to include a condition like that, that could be something that could be included.
Thank you.
Councillor Stavry.
Thank you, Mr Chair. My question relates to, I guess, to the number of students, and I guess what I'm thinking from just listening to the discussion is that, and I could be interpreting this incorrectly, so guidance would greatly assisting here, that the 22 are the maximum that they could have in that site as it's been, or you can't have any more students, is what I understand, right?
Thank you. Through you, Mr Chair. Yes, condition 10 of the permit states that there is a requirement of only 22 children on site at any one time.
Sure. So my follow-up is then, and the play area is predicated on that number being, there is no more room there either in the play area. It would be, with the current number of 22 students, the open space play area would be completely utilised as per the standard.
Thank you. Through you, Mr Chair. While the play area relative to the number of children is not a specific planning permit requirement, we understand that that is part of the regulations, that the 154 square metre area is relative to the number of 22 children. So the two comply.
So it's and I'm not leading you at all. It's just that I wanted to understand before asking the question. So in things, in most walks of life, we require a little bit of tolerances to ensure that we're not cutting up against some sort of hard boundary. Would there be a consideration to perhaps reducing the number of students by 1 or 2 to just make sure that there's those buffers in, and it would contribute to most of the issues that have been spoken about tonight? Potentially take a little bit off the parking spots, take a little bit off not having, a problem of having 2 people on site, etc. Just a hypothetical, but also a response would be much appreciated.
Thanks, through you, Mr Chair. I think the difficulty will be, once again, if that ends up in VCAT, what's the basis for the reduction in student numbers? I mean, the car parking complies, the open space, complies with the state regulation. So, it's going to be very difficult to go into VCAT and say, oh, well, we just knocked a few off. We thought that'd make it a bit more reasonable, a bit easier, given that there's then a little bit of a margin for compliance. I think that would be very difficult to argue. I mean, they've complied with the car parking rate, so that deals with effectively with the number of students. We think that there's appropriate conditions in relation to amenity issues. It is open to councillors to move a reduction. We just think it would be difficult. And that's why we've prepared the recommendation that we have tonight.
I guess one of the reasons one might argue is that, let's say
I need a question here. If this is, remember we're in questions, so.
So my question would be about the sort of buffers that I'm talking about. I mean, if they were to use some sort of play or educational material in that open space, that would take up the space. So a little bit of a buffer would actually allow them to do that without needing to get some special permits or what have you. So that's the rationale that I'm coming at it from.
Don't think that's a question, Councillor Stavro.
There is one in there, Jim. I can formulate it if you like.
The only question I'm sort of wrangling with is what's the question, but I'm going to move on to Councillor Bigger for her question. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions. The first is just that it seems to me that the objectors have raised a fair point about the, I suppose, the change from the traffic assessment in 2018, that for me, knowing some of the increases in school sizes over the last few years, I don't know the exact numbers on Camberwell South, I do know other similar schools where we've had significant increases. So my question really is, what could we do in terms of a traffic assessment? Can you just explain to me how we might attach that to this in a way that would look at whether or not there had been a significant change while in the context of a decision we make tonight?
Thanks through you, Chair. I might pass that one over to Mr Lipscomb, Council's Senior Traffic Engineer.
Thank you. Through you, Mr Chair. In terms of the existing traffic, the available traffic data that was used in the assessment here, ultimately the applicant didn't submit recent traffic data to support the application. However, as stated in the summary, the 2018 data was utilised from an assessment point of view. As stated, a growth factor was applied to that to ultimately assess the capacity of Athelston Road to accommodate the new traffic generation. In terms of given the change in traffic conditions potentially post-COVID, obviously with contributing factors of change in traffic flow in the vicinity of the school, certainly that there may be more comfort given with updated traffic counts taken in Athelston Road, but certainly from the point of view of isolating this particular application, we felt that the existing traffic data at the time, looking at the roads from a capacity point of view, given the largely small traffic generation from this particular use, was sufficient to make a valid assessment at that time. Thank you.
Can I just follow on? So does that mean we can't, there's no way to sort of make a decision, basically a decision that we need to make about this it has to be based on a 2018 traffic, meaning you can't, there's no way to, I'm trying to understand how we couldn't do a traffic assessment that would affect, do you understand what I'm asking? Whether or not we can, if we approve this tonight, then there's no point in doing a traffic assessment after. Were you to do one later and find that actually the traffic had increased by 60%, there was nothing you would do. Do you understand my question? No, nobody does, including me.
I think it's just, before that's answered, it's just worth remembering that we were told that the figures from 2018 have been escalated by a factor of 3% per year. Could I, and if just for the purposes of trying to draw out the understanding, Mr. Lipscomb, can you just comment about whether a 2018 traffic report is, that age, is that unusual? I mean, do we work on older studies at times? How does that sit in the norm of what council encounters?
Thank you. Through you, Mr Chair. Certainly, older data is sometimes utilised in an assessment. The age of a particular data set is very situational in terms of a particular location and the factors in play. Certainly, the existing traffic data that was presented in 2018 from a capacity point of view was significantly lower than the threshold for that particular road type. So from that perspective, we had, and certainly taking into account the applied growth factors, in this case, we had a fair level of surety around the capacity of the road to accommodate the small increase from this development, and from that basis, we made a decision on that in that case. Thank you.
Does that cover it, Councillor Biggar, or is there something further you'd like to ask on that?
I think that answers that question. Can I just ask another question? I apologise because
Sure.
this is my own probably lack of understanding. But just to, given that several people had raised, whether viability of the childcare centre, which I don't think is a relevant consideration necessarily for us, but were it to be proven unviable in 18 months and close, can you just explain to me then what happens to this property? Is it used? Can it only be then used as a childcare centre until we reapprove it back to a house? Or I'm sorry, can you just explain that for me? Thank you.
The permit runs with the land, not with the person. So if the operator changed, that could happen without needing any further permission from council, and the childcare centre could continue. If the use of the land stopped for, I think it's 2 years or longer, then it would revert to a use which is as of right under the planning scheme in terms of what it could be used for. That would include, for example, a dwelling. If someone wanted to use it, for example, for a non-residential use that's permissible under a residential zone, subject to a permit, then they'd need to apply for that permit, and there'd be obviously going through the process and reassessment against the relevant provisions in the planning scheme.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Galt.
Thank you. I'm really just picking up on where Susan left off. Gosh, my directions have disappeared. Now they're back on again. I am not totally convinced by the advice on traffic. The figures used related to 63 Athelstone Road, and I...
Could I just get you to get a little bit closer to the mic?
Sorry.
Thanks.
Is that all right? Thank you. The information we were using is from 63 Athelstone Road. Between Toorak Road and Athelstone Road, there sits Range Street and Donabuang Street. I have it on very good authority. It's a really good spot to chuck a lefty off Toorak Road and chuck a righty down Range or Donabuang Street and get back onto the side street, thereby ducking the intersection with Glen Iris Road. So I suspect there's a lot of traffic movements that would have been missed by the study at 63 Athelstone Road. Further, directly across the road from the site, there is a Caltex service station. And there's a lot of movement in and out of that service station, which will almost certainly have been missed by any studies at 63. I understand the arguments about increasing, taking the 2018 study and adding 3% per annum, but one of the presenters tonight raised an issue about a school...
Question, just try and focus on the question. So
I am. Yep. I need to make 3 points leading up to it through you, Chair. Okay. The final point raised tonight was there has been changed condition in the school around there. So they strike me as I was concerned when there was no traffic study submitted with this application, and all these other issues about concentrated traffic issues in that area. I am far from convinced that we do have a...
I really do need you to focus on the question.
The question is
whether you're convinced or not.
I think we need to have a traffic study that relates to this site current.
That's not a question.
Okay, let me rephrase it.
Please as a question, because the debate comes after questions.
Thank you, Chair. I shall attempt to turn it into a question. Are we able to ask this applicant to provide us with a current traffic study which takes traffic conditions directly adjacent to this site into consideration?
Thanks through you, Mr Chair. Yes, that would require not actually making a decision on this application tonight.
Correct.
We don't have, I guess, a statutory basis for asking for further information because that time is actually gone. We have 28 days from the date of the lodgement of an application to ask for further information. So, you know, the applicant could say, well, no, your traffic engineers have actually assessed it. You've written that in a report that they're fully supportive. So, you know, we'll head off to VCAT for, you know, failure to make a decision within the statutory timeframe and take our chances there. I think that, you know, that might well be an outcome of deferring the matter and asking them for, asking them to prepare a traffic report. But it's certainly within council's powers to, you know, defer the application tonight, and we can ask them for that information. Thanks.
I'm looking for some guidance on how I press forward with this. I mean, I'm generally in acceptance of the proposal. I think it's a good one. I'm not too fussed about the front yard, but I do think there's a major gap in our information. And I do think there's a strong case to say we shouldn't pass this tonight.
If you want some guidance, perhaps the question that ought to be asked of Council's senior traffic engineer who's seated in close proximity to you is there the need, in your professional opinion, for an updated traffic report?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, the environment itself, the intersection of Toorak Road and Athelston Road, has a number of existing issues and certainly some concerns around congestion in particular periods, which obviously the development itself would be marginally contributory to, should it be approved. I guess the scale of the development itself and the generation or the traffic generation that the site itself would contribute to that existing situation, in my professional opinion, would be rather minor, and from the perspective of the existing issues at the intersection, from a traffic perspective and a congestion perspective, they would ultimately be, as I say, minor in their contribution. So from the perspective of obviously changing conditions in the vicinity of the site, I certainly acknowledge that, given the information presented tonight. From the perspective of a capacity point of view, or other sort of limitations that we typically assess our developments on, given the generation, I was comfortable in the assessment that was made.
Thank you. And Mr. Wickramasinghe wants to add to that.
Probably, Mr. Lipscomb, just for clarity, I think the question was, do you believe there is a need for an additional traffic report? It's almost a yes or no.
Certainly, it would be of some benefit to give up-to-date traffic data. As to the implications on the development, I'm uncertain, given its contributory elements.
Could I make an attempt to ask another brief question in relationship to that?
As long as it's a question, yes.
It will be a question of the officer. If the additional studies were to show that, given all the other movements around this area, took the conditions in the area right to its limit, could the small additional load placed by the new use at drop-off and pick-up time push it over those limits to a point that it was unacceptable?
Through you, Mr. Chair. No, I don't believe so. Certainly, given the existing traffic data that we had available to us, certainly the quantum that is being generated by the site isn't such that would push it to that level of threshold. Yeah, it was certainly well within the threshold, but that's acceptable.
Thank you. Councillor Thompson. Sorry, wait a minute.
Thanks through, Mr. Chair. If I could just add to Mr. Lipscomb's response. So just noting that a local street like Athelston Road has a design capacity of 3,000 vehicles a day. So taking the 2018 figure and applying a 3% growth per year on top of the traffic volume that was recorded then, that would equate to 1,121 vehicles a day. So well within the design capacity of Athelston Road. We're not talking about marginal, we're talking about 1,121 vehicles a day as opposed to a design capacity of 3,000 vehicles a day. Thank you.
It's well less than half. Councillor Thompson.
With your indulgence, Chair, because I recognise I've already asked one question, but it's a follow-up from my
That's
earlier
fine.
one. Thank you. And this pertains to officers indicating that they've run this through our Department for Childcare. So I'm just looking at the Australian Childcare Education and Quality Authority, which sets out some of the ratios. I've just a question here as to whether this is actually possible, because it references the 1 to 11 ratio of educators to students. The question that I've got here and the statement that it says here is working directly with children means physically present with the children directly involved in providing education and care to those. If we've only got 2, question is, how do they take a break? How do they assist changing a nappy? Are they supervising all students? Are they supervising more students if they need to go to a toilet break or actually make lunch?
Thanks. Through you, Mr Chair. Look, that kind of detail is well beyond what we would consider under a planning application. The applicant has advised that they can operate with 2 staff. That's the condition that we have placed on the planning permit. If the planning permit gets issued, then they'll need to operate and work it out so that they have the 2 staff on site. Otherwise, they would be in breach of their planning permit. But the regulations are there. The planning provisions in relation to car parking are there, and we've got a proposed condition for 2 staff only on site. Thank you.
Councillor Franco.
Thank you. I have a few questions. Firstly, the traffic study of 2018, was that conducted by council or by the applicant?
Through you, Mr Chair. It was a council obtained traffic count, so yes, by council.
Why wasn't the obligation placed on the applicant, or is that conventional practice for council to do the study?
Certainly the study was undertaken in general course of updating traffic data for the road network. Certainly in this case the application was not accompanied by traffic reports, so in lieu of that ultimately existing data was utilised to form an assessment around the application.
Is that because it was a failure on the part of the applicant to provide something that was required and we help them out, being candid, or they simply, was it something we conventionally do?
Thanks through you, Mr Chair. Not every application is required to be accompanied by a traffic report. So the assessment in this case was because of the small size of the childcare centre, that there was no traffic report required and that our traffic engineers were quite capable of doing that assessment. So there's not a statutory requirement to provide a car parking and traffic report for every application. In this case, the car parking actually complied with the standard in the scheme. And as I said, given the size of the childcare centre, we didn't think it was necessary for the applicant to provide a traffic assessment and that our traffic engineers could carry it out.
Councillor Franco, just in asking those questions, you might consider that how you phrase them, because I think the question that was council helping out developers, clearly that's not what you intended to say, but...
No, I didn't mean it in any untoward fashion. Look, yes, I'll be clear, I didn't mean it in any untoward fashion. I simply meant...
yeah, no, that's fine. I just sort
of... in relation to that point then, how unreasonable... This goes back to the question that Councillor Gold was asking. If we were to seek to defer this and require an up-to-date traffic study by the applicant, is that something that would be considered completely unreasonable and out of order, or within some reasonable scope. I appreciate the applicant might appeal to VCAT. And just in answering that, I noted you said there were 28 days of lodgement for requesting of further information, but 28 days, this application, I understand, was long before I was elected to council, long before I paid attention. I think it was early last year. And I'd just like to understand how it's taken so long to get here in 2021, in May of 2021. This is the first I'd come across this application was in the last week or so.
So the length of time taken to process this application was due to the application being in the applicant's hands to come up with a solution for on-site car parking that would actually work. So it has taken the applicant this long to come back with that information. You know, the application is still live. It still needs to be processed in terms of whether, you know, now asking them for to undertake a traffic generation report, a traffic assessment. You know, we've prepared the recommendation. We think the application is worth supporting. We think it gets across the line without the applicant producing a traffic report, because our traffic engineers have carried out that assessment, and in their professional assessment they believe that the traffic generation will not significantly impact on the operation and amenity of the surrounding roads. So short answer is we don't think a traffic report would be necessary.
Just I think an element of the question related to the 28 days as well. Mr Mitchell, do you know where we sit within that 28 days at all?
Through you, Mr Chair, yeah, well beyond the 28 days from the lodgement of the application. That's the statutory time frame to require further information. So, as I mentioned earlier, there'd be no statutory basis on, you know, we could certainly ask them for a traffic report, but there would be no need for them to actually submit it, because we'd have no statutory power to ask for it under the Planning Environment Act. Requests for further information have to be asked for within 28 days of receiving an application. As I said, you know, one of the things that may occur if we defer the application is that there may be then an appeal against failure to make a decision, because we're now sort of outside of the 60 days.
Okay, thank you. Mr Storer.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Just so there's no confusion, there are two different timing parameters we need not to confuse. One of them is the time the planners have to seek further information when an application is lodged. The other one is the time they have available to make a decision, a determination. And they are two different times. The risk with this particular application is more that if you seek to go for a deferral, pending receipt of further information, that we are probably almost certainly, I'm looking at Mr Mitchell, probably almost certainly going to find ourselves at that point where we've failed to make a decision within the statutory time frame, which means that the applicant then has recourse to VCAT on the basis of a failure to determine the application. In that situation, you find yourselves still able to make an indication as to the decision you would have made, so that when we go to VCAT, we're able to argue a case with confidence as to what position council might have taken. But the decision is now then going to sit in VCAT's hands, because they will have a failure appeal before them and they'll be asked to make a determination on the application. So that the biggest impact, if you like, of a deferral is the risk of a failure to determine appeal. That's the most likely outcome you would face. And I would just make the point, if I've understood what's been said correctly, that you have a road with capacity to accommodate around 3,000 vehicles a day, currently carrying around 1,100 vehicles a day. So you're looking at this application and wondering whether it's likely to generate more than 2,000 vehicle trips a day. Unless you can come to the view that that's the likely outcome, then it would be difficult to make sense of a deferral to obtain further information regarding traffic data.
Thank you. Okay, so Councillor Franco,
Yes.
do you have any further
I have some further questions. I also want to foreshadow that in general business, if this gets approved, I'll be moving a motion in traffic-related motion in general business straight after.
That's fine. Okay, so your questions?
But I have some other questions, yes. In relation, this is some procedural questions in terms of the, and I'll just preface it very, very quickly by there are concerns have been expressed about the quality of the open space and the need for the open space, but could you explain the process in relation to approvals to be obtained from the relevant state government authority and whether those, if they come after, so if council gives an approval here, then the applicant has to go to the state government and get a secondary approval, or do we issue a referral and they get approval in terms of open space to meet all the requirements? And the reason I ask that question is because it's a bit odd if we give an approval on certain assumptions.
That's fine. Officers can answer that. Can I just ask you to sort of touch through the rest of your questions, because officers can make a note as you ask them, and then we might be able to get through the questions a little bit more quickly.
All right. Well, look, this is the main. There's two more. One is in relation to the use of Bowen Gardens and whether it's expected that the centre, one of the speakers raised Bowen Gardens, and I wonder if that's to be used or if that's contemplated or if that's just an assumption. And furthermore, just in relation to the 11:1 ratio, my understanding, and I didn't look it up like Councillor Thompson, but he's gone and looked it up. My understanding is that relates for children that are, I'm guessing here, from 4 years old or so up to primary school age, but not for the very young children where the staff ratio are much higher. So if the centre were to change the ratio, how do we know it's 11:1? Can they just then say we're approved as a childcare centre? Oh, we've now got toddlers or whatever it is and we need a different staff ratio. How do we control that? But that probably comes back to the question about the process.
Yep, and that's it? Okay.
Thanks, through Mr. Chair. Just in relation to the relationship between, a planning permit and approval required under, separate state legislation, I note that there are two separate pieces of legislation, so they would need both approvals. So if they don't get a planning permit, obviously doesn't go ahead. If they don't get their state government approval, obviously doesn't go ahead. So they need both sets of approvals to actually open the childcare centre.
Can we just keep going with your answers, and then we'll double back if there's any need for...
In terms of the use of Bowen Gardens, that's just speculation that it may or may not be used. They have open space provided on site. And lastly, in relation to the ratios of childcare of children and their ages and how that might impact on staff, I'd simply note that we have a condition that sets out the maximum number of staff, a condition that sets out the maximum number of students, and we have a car parking requirement in the planning scheme. So the way that we have set that up in this planning permit all matches. If there is any change to that, whether it's a requirement under state legislation that they increase the number of staff at any time because they've changed their age ratio, then they would need to come back to us for further approval. And that would require a reconsideration of traffic impacts, car parking and the rest of it.
Just bear in mind that the notion of requiring multiple approvals isn't unusual in this chamber. There's the common example of obtaining a planning approval and then subsequently requiring a building approval, the absence of either causing the proposal to fall over. So it's not dissimilar to that scenario. But if you need a clarification question from the answers.
Yes, just a clarification. Look, I thank you for that, Chair. It's often with other state approvals, we undertake the consultation process with the state and refer it off for advice and it comes through. So I just found it a bit unusual in this case. And look, this is probably I'm sure if you're saying it, that this is the process that we follow, and, you know, it's up to the applicant to then go off. But then do they say, look, we've got council approval, therefore that counts for some weight in their next application or applications?
Through you, Mr Chair. So the assessment of a planning application requires consideration of the planning scheme, and the planning scheme sets out referral authorities. So, you know, for some things that are located, you know, for some developments that are located, for example, in an area that's identified as having some flood risk and has an overlay that triggers a planning permit, then we would seek we're required to seek the views of the relevant floodplain manager. You know, but that's in the planning scheme. So there's nothing in the planning scheme that says we need to refer or get approval first or get approval second from the relevant state authority. That is a separate piece of legislation, and the applicant would be required to get that approval before they could open. Thanks.
Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Question for the officers, which may have been answered early when they responded after question time, but I didn't hear the answer, so I apologise. Ms Hines questioned about the waste collection and whether or not it was general waste or a commercial waste. And I think her question was, if it's general waste with council waste service collection, a fortnightly general waste bin empty wouldn't be adequate for a childcare centre. Can I ask if that question was responded to?
Thank you. Through you, Mr Chair. Yes, it is proposed to collect the waste via council collection. The application was referred to Council's Waste Services Department, who reviewed the proposal and said that it was acceptable for council collection.
Excuse me, Chair, may I have a very quick follow-up question?
Yes.
Thank you. So if it's deemed childcare for 22 children with 2 staff, a general collection once a fortnight isn't adequate, could the centre then apply for a commercial bin? And my follow-up question then is, would they have provision for a commercial bin to hold larger waste?
Through you, Mr Chair. Look, I think that would be a matter that would be separate consideration from the planning application. I mean, they might very well apply for, commercial bin pickup. But as I said, we've referred it to our waste management people. Waste management people are the experts. They've said, yep, that's fine. We can collect. We think it's okay. And we've got a standard condition on.
Thank you.
Just checking on your name. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Councillor Park. It appears that questions may have been exhausted, and taking into consideration officers' advice, I'd be willing to move a motion.
Just seeking that advice, actually, as you speak.
And perhaps I might predicate it by a question to see if officers think there is any risk in deleting clause 11 from the officer's recommendation.
Mr Mitchell, or who's going to answer that?
Thanks through you, Mr Chair. Perhaps a suggestion to assist. We think that rather than deleting that the number, which we think is a bit problematic in terms then of car parking provision on site, potentially, that we just add the words after, in condition 11, after must not exceed 2 at any time. If we add during the hours of operation, I think that would then allow some flexibility for, a staff meeting after work where there's no children actually in attendance.
Thanks, Mr Mitchell, and through you, Chair, I'm happy to accept officers' advice and request also the inclusion of the word staff after the number 2, so that should a tradesperson be required to attend during hours or something similar to that, then that wouldn't be precluded if there was a maintenance item or similar. So the final sentence would, or the final line there would read, must not exceed 2 staff at any one time during operating hours, which is 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. according to the report.
Okay, so without encouraging anybody, I just want to confirm that we've exhausted all questions. So I did preface that, Councillor Franco, but
I wanted to raise an issue that Councillor Addis had raised about permits, about restricting permits, and I thought it was a good point. And I just don't want that.
Yes, thank you. And you're happy to incorporate a notation to that effect as part of the motion that I'm going to say you've just moved.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay,
I did
thank you.
open my comments with taking officer advice, and that was one piece of it.
So I think give us a moment to just assemble that so that it's clear for all. I'm going to propose a 5-minute adjournment so we're not all just sitting around looking at each other. So who would like to? Councillor Bigger's moving that, and that's seconded by Councillor Sinfield.
Thanks, Chair.
I put that motion. Those in favour, that's carried with great enthusiasm and unanimity. Thank you. We're adjourned for about 5 minutes. Councillors, I need to get my quorum back together, or full attendance would be even nicer. I'd like a motion to resume, please.
So moved.
Councillor Thompson, seconded Councillor Watson. I put that motion. Those in favour? Those against? That's carried unanimously to the extent of the councillors who are present and voting. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the adjournment. Prepared to put the motion as I foreshadowed earlier, which has a change to clause 7, which was clause 11 in a previous iteration, but I'm advised by officers that there was some erroneous paragraph numbering, so in fact it is clause 7 to which I refer. The motion is on the screen and I'm happy to speak to it when the time is right.
Thank you. The slight difficulty in reading that second last line, is that just reflection or something, or yeah, it is. Maybe if we could just shuffle it down, it might. No. Yeah, there we go. We just need to stand there holding it. Anyway, look, everybody can read that, so we won't keep you there for long. Maybe if you put something heavy on it. All right. So I'm looking for a seconder. Councillor Thompson is seconding that. To assist Councillor Sinfield, is there opposition? There is some. So, Councillor Sinfield, speak to your motion, please.
Thank you, Chair. The basis for the amendment to clause 7 is that the care of the children on site is paramount for me. There are competing priorities, naturally, with the parking and the amenity for surrounding residents. However, in consultation with some of my colleagues, we feel that the allowance of a third staff member on site or a proprietor or a person related to the proprietor or so forth allows for a tradesperson, it allows for a guest music teacher, for example. It allows for also having a changeover period, as the hours of the operation of the centre, 8 a.m. till 5 p.m, are long daycare hours. So if there was a need to have a staff changeover and a slight overlap, they would not be in breach of a permit condition by doing so. I note also that officers have prepared the addition to the permit notes, which include the clause, or it's not really a clause, it's a note, stating that resident and visitor parking permits will not be issued to the operator or staff of the childcare centre. So any additional staff member and alike would need to either catch public transport or an Uber or something like that, and not park on site, because they do need to allow for the 2 vehicle spaces for parents dropping off and picking up. I think that this, after countless minutes of debate and circular argument on various clauses of this, I think that this is a reasonable and compromised outcome that seeks to ensure the appropriate care and supervision of the children and the welfare of the staff also being facilitated for breaks and so forth. So I'll leave my comments there. There's no need to further torture this, I don't think, and I welcome the comments of my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, if we have any. If not, there we go. Councillor Haddis.
I can't support adding 1 extra staff. It just puts more pressure on the local neighbourhood. It seems to me that, given that it's called staff, if you needed to get a tradesperson in, they're probably a contractor, not a staff member, and so they wouldn't be excluded. What we're effectively doing here is allowing 3 full-time staff. I just don't understand why we would offer more than somebody's asking for when there is already concerns in the neighbourhood about what this will do to their living conditions. So I could support, I was very happy to support the original that said during operating hours, because that seemed to me that the pressure would be off then, but this is
gone a step too far for me.
Thank you. Councillor Franco.
I share the same views as Councillor Addis. I can't support this motion. It'll exacerbate the situation for the local community. I know the site, and and I appreciate that, you know, the care of children is a priority, but if this site isn't suitable to meet the minimum requirements for a childcare centre, then perhaps we shouldn't be approving it for that purpose. But look, I'm not going to support this motion.
Thank you. Councillor Watson.
Thank you. I also don't support the amendment or this motion. I support the original one. The original motion complied with legislation, so my reason for objecting is slightly different, but I just don't think we should be telling people how to run their businesses. They comply to staff as what was required, and I would stick with that.
No other lights on, so I'll give a contribution. I don't think that indicating a maximum number of staff of 3 versus 2 is telling the operator how to run their business, firstly. Secondly, I think perhaps in the enthusiasm to limit the number of staff, councillors maybe are forgetting that this is a commercial operation, and you know, how many commercial operations, particularly small ones, increase the number of staff because the planning permit says that they can. If the number of staff required is 2, then I think we could be reasonably certain that's the number of staff that will be present. However, the intention of the motion, as I understand it, is that it allows for that staff changeover and the like, and that's just good common sense. They don't find themselves in a technical trifling breach because of something like that. And what I mean by technical and trifling, it might be a 10, 15, 20-minute overlap. So I also note that that change doesn't have any impact in terms of car parking requirements. So I'm going to support the motion as it's been moved. If there's no other speakers, I'll return to Councillor Sinfield for her right of reply.
Thanks, Chair. Given the level of opposition, I don't think that that's necessary at this time. Thank you.
So I'll put that motion. Those in favour? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is carried. So that's done. Thank you. That takes us then to item 4, general business. Councillor Franco.
Thank you.
Nice to hear from you.
For a change. I would like to move a motion in relation to council undertaking traffic studies in Athelston Road and Range Road, Camberwell.
We'll just put that up for you.
Thank you.
As you've circulated that.
I think in light of the approval that's just been given to the development in question, I think this is appropriate. Can I speak to this, or
we'll
do I need
just see if there's
I do want to make a slight change to the wording that's up there.
Yep. Could you just tell us what that is?
So, if I read through, I'm going to add the words assess traffic safety, okay, in 2 locations. So it would read that council, 1, undertakes a traffic study in Athelston Road and Range Street, Camberwell, prior to the opening of the childcare centre at 979 Toorak Road, Camberwell, to assess traffic safety and determine whether does that make sense? And assess traffic safety, it's not written there, and determine whether the traffic speed, volume and parking levels in these streets exceed the threshold limits for residential streets, and council's traffic management and parking management policies and associated procedures. Should any issues be identified, a further report be submitted to council in relation to any measures required, etc. And then just add those words, assess traffic safety in the same location in section 2. Because I do think there are some traffic safety issues at this
I'll
location.
just stop you there and we'll see if there's a councillor who's willing to second that motion. Councillor Goltz.
I'm willing to second that.
So, Councillor Franco, you could speak to your motion.
Thank you.
I might just test, if you like, at this juncture to assist Councillor Franco, is there any opposition? There is, Councillor Franco, so if you speak to your motion.
Thank you. I do consider that at this location there are some traffic and parking challenges, especially traffic safety challenges for the residents in the vicinity. Toorak Road is an extremely busy road with high volumes of traffic and at speed, and there are a significant number of users in Athelstan Road and people who come out undertaking right and left-hand turns out of Athelstan Road and coming in. There are challenges for some of the residents, as we've heard tonight, accessing their very own driveway. So we heard from a resident who was talking about the challenges coming home. I think if any one of us came home and couldn't get into our own driveway, we'd be expecting that council would look at this and take it seriously. So I do think if we turn our back and ignore such basic requirements, it would be a challenge. I can't see that we should walk away from this. I recognise that we've given an approval to the childcare centre, although the operator of that childcare centre still has to go out and get further approvals to operate. And that will increase, it'll be a marginal increase, and this is a point I made before. There are many other attractors and that draw traffic in and parking, particularly on that corner. But it's incumbent on council to ensure the safety of our urban environment and the amenity for those residents. Thank you.
Are there any other speakers? Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. And to assist in my decision making as to whether I support the motion that is on the screen or not, I wonder whether I might ask a question through you to officers as to what such a traffic study would cost, please.
I'm willing to allow that, and subject to Councillor Franco, you don't have any objection. So we are in debate, but all right, I'll allow that question.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. In terms of a rough gauge, I would expect something in the vicinity of perhaps $5,000 to $10,000, perhaps.
$5,000 to $10,000
for a traffic study, certainly with surveys and all associated.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. I don't support the motion. We heard from officers tonight that the roads are operating well within capacity. What I did hear is that there does seem to be a bit of rat running happening on a couple of roads, but I'm not sure that that requires a whole traffic study. I think that the officers could deal with the problems, and so I won't be supporting the motion tonight.
Are there any other speakers? Then I'll just indicate my opposition to the motion as well. I think the difficulty in getting in or out of one's driveway is something that some of us experience every single time that we try to get in or out of our driveway. So that's sadly just part and parcel of living on a heavily trafficked street or in a popular municipality such as Boroondara. Much as we try to encourage people to use bicycles in lieu of vehicles, there's steadfast resistance amongst some. But in any event, the impact of this development on a road that is so far below capacity is a drop in the ocean. That's the simple fact of the matter. So in my view, that's $10,000 that could be much better and more effectively spent elsewhere. On that basis, I won't support the motion. Councillor Franco, your right of reply.
Thank you. Look, I'll keep it short. I think people have made up their minds, but I do think that a small traffic study in this very specific small precinct, it's not an expansive traffic study. That guess of $5,000 was just an assumption, but it's a routine operational matter funded out of the operational budget. It's not something that's excessively costly, and I think it's core business for us as a municipality to address traffic issues in local areas. And this is very, very targeted, very narrow to a particular location. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I'll put that motion. Those in favour? Those against? That motion is lost. Are there any other items of general business? Councillor Addis.
Can we request officers just to have a look at the area as a business as usual type exercise?
It's not uncommon for us to make a request like that administratively. Mr. Story, you're happy to proceed on that basis?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Content with that, Councillor Addis?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Are there any other items of general business? Item 5, urgent business. Are there any items of urgent business? Item 6, confidential business. Are there any items of confidential business? Then I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.